Good afternoon and welcome to Silences in the Lambs, Digital Surrogacy in the Time of Pandemic. My name is Mary Haynes and I'm the Collections Management Librarian at the Historical Medical Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. I'm also the current co-PI along with Kelsey Dunkirken at Thomas Jefferson University on the grant-funded project that is the basis for the symposium for the Health of the New Nation, Philadelphia as the Center of American Medical Education, 1746 to 1868. For the Health of the New Nation is a collaborative project with 6 other repositories within the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries, otherwise known as PACSCL, generously funded through a grant from the Digitizing Hidden Collections initiative of the Council on Library and Information Resources, which is in turn supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The grant will digitize and make freely available on Internet Archive over 140,000 pages of primary resources documenting the foundation of American medical education in Philadelphia. This symposium will not explore the history of American medical education. Instead, prompted by the closures that began in March, closures that we are all still dealing with in one way or another, Silences in the Lambs provides a glimpse into how the pandemic has impacted our teaching, our ability to work with researchers and students, and how digital surrogates enable that work or not. And now I will turn things over to Beth Lander, who will discuss the logistics for today's event.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Beth Lander, and I'm the Managing Director of the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries, and I was Mary's predecessor at the Historical Medical Library as co-PI on For the Health of the New Nation. You should have all received a schedule earlier today for the symposium via Eventbrite. If you need it, if you don't have it, let me know via chat, and I will share the schedule via chat. I'll be introducing each presenter or panel at the beginning of their presentation. While we do have specific Q&A times built into the schedule, each panel or presenter has asked that you be given the opportunity to submit questions at the very end of their sessions. So Mary and I will be monitoring the chat and keeping track of anything that you would like to bring to their attention. You may post comments or questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring, and other attendees will be able to see everything that you post. So in case you would like to say hello to anybody that you recognize, please do. The symposium is being virtually hosted by the University of Pennsylvania, one of the partners in For the Health of the New Nation. Thanks to Mitch Froz, Senior Curator of Special Collections at the Kislak Center at Penn, for helping us get off the ground, and also to Betsy Deming, Educational Technology Support Technician at Penn, for her technical assistance today. The symposium is in a webinar format, which means that you will not be visible during the event. You will also be muted during the event, but are welcome to submit questions and comments, as I mentioned, through the chat function. The webinar and chat will be recorded and will be made publicly available at a later date via the Historical Medical Library's blog, Fugitive Leaves. So thank you again for joining us today, and I'm now going to present our keynote speaker, Melissa Graff, who joined Yale University as the John R. Bumstead Librarian for Medical History at the Harvey Cushing John J. Whitney Medical Library in 2011. Dr. Graff works with students and faculty on research, classes, grants, and publications. She manages the staff and collections for the Medical Historical Library. She oversees major digitization projects, it is a word that I cannot say, stages exhibitions in the library, and handles donations, among other duties. Dr. Graff is the past chair, or chair emerita, of the Medical Heritage Library, which is a collaborative digitization and discovery organization committed to providing open access resources in the history of healthcare and the health sciences. Dr. Graff received her PhD in the history of medicine from Johns Hopkins University in 2009. She was a Council of Library and Information Resources postdoctoral fellow at Lehigh University Library, followed by an appointment as the Humanities Librarian at Lehigh. I am delighted to introduce one of my co-conspirators from the Medical Heritage Library and a person whose work I truly admire, Dr. Melissa Graff.
Thank you so much, Beth. and welcome everybody. Let me start by sharing my screen and we'll get into the keynote. So when I was invited to give this keynote, I, couldn't help but kind of dive into the topic that is surrounding us now, and its relationship to kind of the digital world in some sense. And so you can see it is fear of the digital disease, digital surrogacy, and materiality in a COVID-19 world. And what you also see is our images, placards from our collection related to quarantine. As Beth mentioned, I have my degree in history of medicine, and so a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today intersects, or a lot of things I'll be talking about today intersects with history of medicine. I also want to point out that my dissertation was on 18th century American medical education, so I am super excited about the new resource for the health of a new nation that's been put out, and we'll go from there. I'm going to start this keynote by discussing, by mentioning that this is going to be broken down into a couple different categories. And I'll start with a category that was brought up in the call for papers under silences. And recently I received a question from some graduate students asking, where and how do you locate silences in the archive? And in brackets, I put and library and museum. I'm not an archivist, but we certainly have archives in our collections. I'm certainly part of a library, and behind me, we'll be talking about the museum that that I help oversee to some degree. And so in answer to this question, and it's something that I think a lot of us think about, I noted that the construction of archive and library collections and what's left out or pushed aside is always in the background of my mind when I am selecting materials for primary source sessions for classes, when I hold consultations for researchers in the Yale community, when I am doing my own research, when I am working with donors, when what I decide to acquire or digitize based on how things fit, depending on the project parameters. There's a lot that goes in my mind when I'm thinking about the silences in our collection. And I often think about, where did the silences begin? And this is related to, in some sense, the three founders of our library. And I'm sure many of you have collections that are similar, and that were begun by, for me, doctors, three doctors in particular, Dr. Harvey Cushing on the left-hand side, John Fulton on the top, and Dr. Arnold Clubbs in the bottom. These three gentlemen got together in the early 20th century in this kind of golden age of book collecting and this kind of veneration of medical history. And so when these three gentlemen got together and said, yeah, we will give you our collection if you build us a library, and we'll merge all our collections together, Yale took up that opportunity by 1939. And so we ended up with a collection that it's fabulous in many different ways. We have over 100 different call numbers in our collection, things related to inoculation, herbals, military medicine, incunables, all over the place. But a problem, not a problem with our collection, something about our collection that I'm sure affects a lot of your collections as well, is that our collection skews towards European, male, white authors, and great texts in the history of medicine and history of science. And again, don't get me wrong, these texts are fabulous, and we use them a lot when we are teaching and in our research, and they're quite stunning, but they help bring the silences into sharp relief. Race, if it is represented at all, is usually depicted through clinical and anatomical studies and treatises. Gender is similarly represented, although there are a few female authors in the collection, and usually sex and gender are medically represented. And so, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19 and the requests from our various researchers and the classes that are being taught at Yale, we're facing this very weird, very weird hole in our collections where we're trying to fill, we're trying to fill these silences. We're trying to provide access to these many voices, but our collections as they are, or as they were started, don't provide that material. And then the collection gets more complicated with the museum that I mentioned, which is behind me, the Cushing Center. And the Cushing Center is the home of the Cushing Tumor Registry. Harvey Cushing, the doctor who also gave us many of the books in our collection, created this tumor registry in the early 20th century as a way of trying to better understand how tumors were situated in people's brains. And so it is again, an amazing kind of collection. It is an unusual collection. And it's something where you have to physically be in the space, I think, sometimes to feel and understand what it means to walk among these brains and tumors that represent Cushing's patients. It's funny, we keep calling it the Cushing Center and the Cushing Tumor Registry, but one of the silences that we have in our particular collection is related to this woman, Dr. Louise Eisenhardt. She's really not mentioned anywhere, but she was the co-collaborator really with Dr. Harvey Cushing in assembling the tumor registry. She's the one who kept track of the patients that Cushing operated on. She's the one who reached out to them post-surgically, post-operation, and to find out how they're doing, to understand how they're doing a year later, to keep track of them in a certain type of way. And so one aspect of the Cushing Center that's hidden as people walk into here is the role of Dr. Louise Eisenhardt, something that we're trying to rectify as we move forward. One other group that is masked by both Harvey Cushing and then Louise Eisenhardt and the various staff members of Cushing, Cushing staff members who assisted with putting the collection together are our patients, right? And so when I think about silences, the Cushing Center to me represents this in a couple different ways. We have patients' images through a variety of glass plate negatives, and the images are represented to some degree in the Cushing Center, but the hardest thing for us, the thing that we want to provide, because the brains and tumors behind me represent the last aspects of these patients, the last vestiges of these patients, is their voice, and how that gets represented in anatomical and specimen collections like this is, I think, an ongoing battle for a lot of individuals. So while I know that there is much work to do in making these silences more explicit, whether in collection development or in the spaces that we inhabit online or off, I want to turn to the ways that digital collections offer some relief from these silences while they create others. So we're going to go to digital surrogacy, which is another theme for the conference. And what is digital surrogacy? I reached out, I looked online, and the Society of American Archivists provides a generous definition, or at least definition in some larger notes. A digital surrogate is a digital copy of an analog record. And a lot of we work with these all the time. We don't call them digital surrogates often. We've digitized collections, we have digitized materials, we have digitized objects. But what we're saying is that we're taking an analog or physical object and we're creating a digital version of it. And so you're welcome to read through the entire definition, but I'm going to jump from there. And I will say that I became a huge fan of digital surrogacy during the research phase of my dissertation, which focused on the medical practice of Dr. John Archer and the medical education of his sons and apprentices at Archer's home and county in Maryland, and at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Just as a kind of a little bit of trivia, if you ever see his name on Jeopardy, you can respond by saying, "Who is the first graduate of an American medical school by virtue of the fact that his last name started with the letter A?" That's John Archer. As I mentioned, I became a fan of digital surrogacy because when I was a graduate student, the University of Pennsylvania at the Kislak Center very kindly digitized this ledger. This is Ledger C of his work. There were multiple ledgers in the series representing the 40 years of John Archer's practice. And it has his notes, his fees, the debts, and it really covers a span of time for Archer that was critical to his career. And honestly, as a researcher going into the reading room there, trying to make sense of something that looks like this within the space of a few hours or even a few days was beyond my ability. So again, they kindly digitized this ledger and made it available a number of years ago. And it was something that was critical to the work that I was doing. I think a lot of researchers are in the same boat right now, where they're depending on libraries and archives as much as they can to digitize material and make it available, which puts pressure on us, but I think really has some major benefits, especially for those who just cannot access the archives any other way. Beyond digitization at individual institutions, I became a big fan of kind of consortial digitization when I became a member of the Medical Heritage Library. Well, Yale was a founding member of the Medical Heritage Library. So for a number of years, I was co-chair and then president of this organization. And as Beth mentioned, it's a variety of medical libraries and institutions with historical and heritage collections who began digitizing material in 2010, about 10 years ago now, and we'll be having a conference on it on November 13th, and making these available. So when the Medical Heritage Library first started, they had grants. They started with printed volumes, and the collection has now blossomed to over 320,000 items on Internet Archive. And having something of this scale, at this scale, and providing it for researchers, for students, for anybody who just is trying to figure out what's happening in a moment of medical history. And the 1918 flu pandemic is a great example of this, where people keep turning to that over and over because it's one of the few models we may have for something that we're facing today. This kind of collection brings so much together. It can be a little overwhelming. And as I mentioned, it does focus a lot on the printed book, but recently there's been a bit of a turn to kind of digitized archives. So, as we had, as Beth had mentioned, for the health of the new nation, Philadelphia is the center of American medical education, 1746 to 1868. What you're seeing here are not just printed volumes, right? These are bound manuscripts, they're ledgers, they're lecture tickets, their addresses, faculty notes, matriculation records. And when I looked at the announcement for this, what struck me is that part of the project was to help bring forth the unheard voices of students. Now, I never thought of 18th century students in quite that way. When I think of students and their voices, I think of student advocacy. But this is another avenue to pursue. And so researchers, according to the announcement, will be able to tell stories across communities of gender and race, and through topics such as pharmaceuticals and American botany, homeopathy, educational methods, and the evolution of medical treatment. And so there's some rich material in here that's brought forth because of the collaboration of a number of institutions in the Philadelphia area and beyond. And so in some sense, digital surrogacy provides us with opportunities to really delve into larger collections across the board. And what I'm going to actually pick up one more quote from this by saying that this is from Kelsey, one of the co-principal investigators. Because the physicians flow between institutions across the city, this project will allow physically siloed material to be viewed and analyzed in one place for the first time. This is what we can do as a larger, or as organizations across the nation here. Are there ways that we can somehow bring our collections together, not just through huge aggregators per se, but in some kind of thematic or topical way? Is there, how best can we make materials available to our researchers in a time where they cannot physically go to the archives? And what does this mean moving forward for us as we bring in new collections, or as we look at our older collections and make them digital? Just some larger questions that I have. but I'm not ready to give up on materiality yet. I have to say one other thing that has come to my mind is the role of materiality right now, or even before the epidemic. And in this, I'm going to focus on back in the day, the end of February 2020, where I was giving a large, class, actually several classes, related to the history of anatomy. And while this feels like such a long time ago, I'm not ready to quite give this up yet. But I know that, like many of you, we're rethinking how we do this kind of the presentation, how we do the kind of interaction with our physical materials. It's hard, right? You know, if we're digitizing things, how in the world do we make something like this? You know, the feeling of turning the flaps of the, you know, this large life-size anatomy. You know, how do we peel back the layers? How do we express that to individuals? What is the difference between the physical, them accessing this physically and having this accessing it online? And there are other kinds of materials that we can express online in quite the same way, whether it's the ivory mannequins that you see at the bottom, or the 1960s like build a woman plastic model that you see at the top, or even the picture of the baby in utero, which is part of this large portfolio that's huge. You can't imagine its size unless you see it. And so in the fall, Yale was part of a group that under Ithaka, which is a think tank for libraries and other institutions, Yale with 2,600 other institutions investigated the following. What are the teaching needs of instructors working with primary sources at the undergraduate level in the humanities and humanities-leaning social sciences? That was a driving question. Now, the Ithaka report is still being compiled. It'll be available at the end of December, sometime in the beginning of January. But I want to just put forth a few things that came from the Yale portion of this report. And one of the things that came forward to me is, you know, why teaching with physical primary sources continues to resonate with instructors who have access to special collections, often in dialogue and in juxtaposition with the millions of digitized rare materials most often used in research and teaching. And so when I'm working with students or faculty one-on-one with research, I'm often just turning to the digital materials first. There's so much great material out there that I don't always jump to the physical archives or the physical collections. But when I see teaching going on, at least, you know, at the institution that I'm at Yale, oftentimes it's the merging of the two, but the ability to have something physical in front of the students is still a major part of education here. And again, from Yale's part of the study, I have an instructor who talks about how the person can't teach the difference between a woodcut or engraving, difference between a manuscript on parchment or a book on paper from a digital object. That person can't teach scale. There's essential categories of visual analysis, or these are essential categories of visual analysis. So one of the reasons that this professor gives visual analysis assignments in front of objects is that there's information that you can't get from a digital image. And the ability to turn pages, feel texture, understand scale, work an instrument, and analyze other information embedded into physical objects was described by many of the interviewees as an integral part of the research process and part of the learning for the discipline. Participants also talked about their efforts to show students the importance of serendipity and immersion that often happens when diving into a physical archival collection, opening a box and literally paging through the files. That aha moment when you have a box in front of you and you're pulling the files out very gently, placing them on your table and turning the pages going, wow, look what I have found. Which brings me to this quote. This is the one thing that has been haunting me, or maybe just making me really think more carefully about this. This was in fall 2019 before COVID-19 hit. But the instructor said, we're at a moment where the desire for a tangible haptic encounter with something is to be understood to be an antidote to something that is perceived to be unhealthy in our society, which is the extent to which we reside in the digital sphere. And so it brings me forward to kind of the post-COVID world, where, you know, in the fall 2019, this idea that we can engage in the material world, you know, that many people could try to engage, the students that come in, was available. But now your setups might look something similar to the setup that I have right here for September 2020 class, where I've been teaching classes kind of live using a document camera, multiple computers, and just trying to express somehow the richness of the material in front of us. My question is there some thought to materiality online? How can we express that? And there's a article that I was reading related to digital manuscripts as sites of touch. And Joanna Green has noted that the digital material encounters enabled by social media platforms are equally worthy of analysis as cultural artifacts in their own right, while providing key points of public access to holistic written heritage that help in communicating materiality. For most of the people beyond our researchers and beyond our classes, beyond our institutions, how often does the public really have a chance to engage in a material object? They can see it in an exhibition behind glass. They can sort of see it from afar if you're doing a kind of a live presentation. So how does having digital surrogacy, how does even doing presentations live and turning the pages and zooming into certain pieces, how does that help with access to the archives and other library and other kinds of collections? Ultimately, how do we communicate materiality online? And this comes to me as one of the title pages from a work that we have in a collection, a 1543 book by Andreas Vesalius called the Fabrica. What I love about this is that I sometimes feel, I have some sympathy for Vesalius, who's the gentleman right in the center of this title page, dissecting a corpse, is that there's so many people, clamoring for his attention, so much that's, bombarding us on many different sides, that it's really hard to focus on the person or the object, or trying to just better uncover the material. And so trying to relate materiality online, how does that look? How do we shape this for many different audiences? How do we do this? I don't know. We'll figure this out together, I think. The other thing I want to make sure that we consider is how do we communicate silences online? And this comes to me particularly because the construction of digitized collections often manifests the same silences in our physical collections amplified, right? And it's not only that I have, collections from 3 doctors put together, and there's been a lot of collecting since the 3 founders, of course, but these initial collections, when we put our collections with other institutions who may have had similar kinds of foundings and make these available online through a larger aggregator, how are we amplifying these silences? And I think it's clear, when you try to look for the roots of racism in medicine, for example, and other things, they're hard to surface because our collections sometimes are remarkably similar. On top of that, when we're doing digital projects, it's often unclear to users what choices were made in the digitization process. Why do we select some materials and not the others, right? It's not always easy for a user to understand the construction of a database. And I'm sure many of you, face this when you're trying to explain why certain databases have things and then why certain things are missing, right? I think we need to move beyond institutions in some sense when creating digital collections. And I think that there may be different kinds of opportunities. I'm not seeing it a lot yet, but to engage in our communities more broadly without cultural appropriation or being very aware of that. I think we need to mix up the voices in our collection. Some of this may be that when we start using born digital items more and more through research and through teaching, we may be able to bring in other kinds of voices that we just are not in the bound volumes or not in the collections of some of the researchers some of the papers that we've collected over time. The other good thing, or the other thing I think about with the digital environment, is that while there is privileging of certain voices, there is always the ability to add others in the larger digital world. So I want to end the presentation by thinking more carefully about the silences in our digitized collections and trying to wrap our heads around how materiality will manifest as we move forward in an online world. I bring this lady forward. She's telling you to come hither and uncover the the guts and the depths of the human body. In the same sense, I think we need to think about for our digitized collections and collection development moving forward. And I just want to end this by saying thank you. Email me with any questions, and I look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Melissa, very much for participating in today's symposium. The next session, in her own words, giving voice to early professional medical women, will be run by Margaret Graham, who is the interim director at the Legacy Center, Drexel College of Medicine in Philadelphia, who is also the co-PI for the Paxil project in her own right. She'll be joined by Jessica Clark, who is the archivist at the Barbara Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. She has been at the center in various roles since 2012. Jessica received her BA from the University of Pittsburgh and her MA from Temple University, both in history, focusing on archives and public history. Margaret and Jessica.
Thank you, Beth. I'm Margaret Graham. As Beth said, I'm currently the interim director at the Drexel College of Medicine Legacy Center. Thanks for organizing us all, and thanks, Melissa. That gave us a lot to think about. I am going to be talking about, some of us are going to actually talk about the history of medicine. It's always important with women who get the short shrift, so we actually want to bring in some of that today. I will start with sharing my screen. So it's going to be me and Jessica. I'm going to start with giving an introduction and then bring Jessica on, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit further. We're talking about women in medicine and their journey and impact on medical education and healthcare in Philadelphia. So while the symposium is technically for the health of the new nation and in honor of it, I'm going to introduce another Paxil project in her own right. This project was funded by NEH and CLIR with a little help from a few more friends, and the production period has overlapped with Health of the New Nation. The Bates Center has materials in her own right, and Drexel Med has collections in both projects. The Drexel collections focus on women in medicine, and in Health of the New Nation, we wanted to be sure to include the story of early professional medical women. So we're going to share stories today that are from in her own right, that are essential in understanding early medical education here. This is the URL for the current site for In Her Own Right, but I'm going to actually show you a sneak preview of our new interface, which goes live in a few weeks. In Her Own Right aggregates digitized collections on women's activism in the century leading up to women's suffrage, covering the period 1820 to 1920. And currently we have content from more than 20 regional repositories. So this gets to some of what Melissa talked about. How do we aggregate in a way that is going to be more useful to more users? And this project started quite a while ago, long before we were hit with a pandemic, but obviously becoming more and more relevant. I'm sure plenty of people have participated in or viewed centennial suffrage exhibits or presentations this year. But In Her Own Right concentrates on collections that reflect the backstories preceding and surrounding the work of getting the vote. The project defines activism loosely, essentially any activity undertaken outside the domestic sphere. And the site represents women in education, in housing, in labor, and many more areas. In terms of content at Drexel, we interpreted the very act of women studying to become physicians as activism, because studying and practicing professional medicine was decidedly not womanly in the mid-19th century. And Jessica will reflect on that in a different way about how nursing was treated at that point. And In Her Own Right is all about making connections. And as we need to get more material online and think about how we're using it online, making those connections becomes more and more important. So we're looking for more material, more users, and more exploration. So let me jump to the site itself. And so this is what's coming. It's not what it looks like at the moment. And what we're particularly excited about at this point is that we are realizing our goal of addressing multiple audiences. We've thought from the beginning about young users, K-12 and undergraduates. We thought about scholars, and we thought about people in the digital humanities. So we've got, most sites do some kind of search and browse to get at the material in an unmediated fashion. We have interpreted content for those looking for contextualized resources. And I am particularly happy about the biographical profiles, which provide specific contextualization about individuals, maybe sometimes about organizations. I think it's all individuals at the moment. And we know that younger audiences tend to lean on these for understanding and scaffolding primary sources. So this was a big win for us. And then this link is not live yet, but we also have an API endpoint where data users can go directly for the metadata. And we will also eventually have tools and tutorials about how to use that data. So hopefully it'll be go beyond current users of data. Lastly, coming soon but not yet live is our subject guide visualization, which has categories of activism that lead to search results within those categories. This was another way to address different kinds of users and learners where understanding how the categories connect to each other might help navigate the material and do more with it. So at this point, I will turn it over to Jessica, and then I will be back to talk about women physicians. And then after that, we'll have time for discussion. We are eager to hear any questions or comments that you all have, so drop them in the chat. Beth and Mary, thanks for helping us field them. And over to you, Jessica.
As Margaret mentioned, I'm here to discuss nursing history and nursing education at the turn of the century, the 20th century. I'm going to focus on the material to be used for In Her Own Right, which will be the Mercy Douglas Hospital Training School for Nurses, the only African-American training school in Philadelphia. It was two hospitals, Mercy Hospital and Frederick Douglass Hospital, that merged later. I will also discuss two nurses, Mary Clymer and Chloe Codsworth Littlefield, whose diaries and lecture notes represent the experience of nurses in the 1900s. Frederick Douglass Hospital was founded in 1895, and its early student records and documents tell a multitude of stories. Through its students, such as Mildred Enos and Lillian Walsh and Evelyn Burnham, who you can see on screen, their records show them as women, African Americans, and aspiring nurses. Their stories allow African Americans women's voices to enter into dialogues of asserting their rights, identity, and professionalism. Through student applications, we can see how nurses obtained their education and how nurses sit along multiple lines of healthcare and gender roles. The pre-1920s student records document the demographics of nursing students, including age, educational and employment background, current address, and religion. The records also include letters from applicants, their references, performance evaluation, and employment after graduation. It also includes the subject required for training and the qualities associated with a successful nurse. Qualities included listening to instruction, following orders, general appearance, and their attitudes. As we see in the materials, women came from across the region, even as far away as Chicago and Rhode Island, to train at Frederick Douglass Hospital. And it speaks to the educational opportunities in Philadelphia, but also the lack of institutions accepting Black nurses throughout the country. Nursing was not monolithic. While it had been envisioned as an area for white middle-class women, it was never just that. Black women who wanted to be a nurse were limited in their options and often created their own experience in the community with Black hospitals. As hospitals expanded in size in the 1900s, they needed caregivers for their patients, which led to the creation of hospital-based training schools for nurses. Few hospitals and training schools accepted Black applicants, both in the North and in the South. Black doctors faced similar challenges for medical rotation, and as a result, hospitals were established in their communities, as well as for the patients in their neighborhoods. Frederick Douglass Hospital followed that same pattern and was established to serve as a place for medical students to gain experience and whose patients needed nurses. In addition, it primarily served care for the Black community in Philadelphia, where it was the only hospital at that time that existed specifically for them. At training schools, students were given lessons and lectures, but education was primarily done at the ward and at the bedside. We see in the student records that students were taught to care for each type of hospital patient on each type of hospital ward. This could be the medical ward, the surgical ward, the children's ward, or the women's ward, and they were through day and night shifts. Hands-on experience was a critical part of their education. The other part of their education was lectures given by physicians. Students would take shorthand notes and turn in complete recollections of the lecture for grading. In lecture notes, topics included fevers, importance of sleep, salves and medication, nervous diseases, eye care, antiseptic, and surgery, along with dietitian. The digitized lecture notes from Mary CLIR provide insight into what all nurses were learning during this time. In her notes, we see how she had to write quickly to keep up with her lectures with casual script, use of abbreviations, and frequent misspellings. Along with formal lecture, Mary CLIR recorded her observations as she served as a nurse in training and the tips and tricks she learned. Lecture notes weren't just a critical part of CLIR's coursework. She would have referred to these notes as she did as a practicing private duty nurse. The idea of trained nurses faced resistance, but there was comfort in that women were being educated for a job they had traditionally been tasked with doing. It paved the way for other women to challenge the closed boundaries of women's separate spheres. As the hospital had an inexpensive source of caregivers and student nurses, all graduate students were rarely hired, and new nurses had to become independent wage earners and work as private duty nurses who were contracted to care for the sick at home. In that sense, nurses worked within women's traditional sphere, but were educated wage earners with an intent to continue working even after marriage. Through the student transcripts, the school tracked where graduates found employment. This was often as private duty nurses who would gain clients from connections at doctors' offices, nursing registries, local associations, and other community members. Other nursing positions may have been with local visiting nurses associations, but they were often quotas limiting how many positions could be offered to Black nurses. Nevertheless, nursing enabled women to enter fields of wage and labor. With diaries from Chloe Littlefield, we see how nurses balanced their career along with their social and personal lives. As mentioned, private duty nursing was a nurse hired by a family to care for a specific patient. It often relieved the family of a very burdensome and time-consuming duty of observing the patient, carrying out difficult treatments, and being available 24/7. Nurses had, in some sense, were under the household for that time, but yet distinctly not. The nurse had to balance and maintain their own identity and self. It was originally believed private duty nursing was immensely lonely, but through the records of Littlefield, we see unless the patient was critically ill, she often visited her own friends and family almost each day on an assignment. In addition, Littlefield frequently visited those patients to inquire after their health after they were finished with their assignment to see to maintain a lasting community relationship. Many state boards of nursing also regularly denied African American nurses the right to sit for an examination, which would grant them the right to practice as a nurse. As nurses sought and fought ways to maintain employment, organizations were created to assist in that endeavor, as well as to reform nursing education and create a professional identity. As Black nurses faced exclusion from state and national organizations, they created their own, the National Association for Color Graduate Nurses, in 1908. The NACGN fought for many of the same rights as other nursing organizations, including the right to sit for an examination and to practice fully within their communities, as well as to fight against systemic racism. Nursing organizations in general served as a stepping stone into politics and suffrage as they elected their own leaders and fought legislation and other barriers to full practice. The basic idea of hiring nurses raised profound anxiety about class systems and public versus private spaces. Philadelphia's nursing pioneers changed the idea of hiring nurses for quality care both at home and in hospitals. And in doing so, they and the institutions they served created new and respected opportunities for service to the sick, as well as to nurses who provided that care. Nurses reframed the tradition of gendered expectations that allowed them to renegotiate the terms of experience and reshape their own sense of worth, value, and power. It was also seen that nurses' professionalism could combat professional combination of education and integrity would force white America to acknowledge Black nurses. The interlocking concepts of race, class, and gender shaped identity and nurses' claims to it. Frederick Douglass Hospital nurses held a multitude of identities and sat uniquely within the community. When they were out in the community as student nurses in their uniforms and capes, as you can see here, they were seen as women, African Americans, a nurse, a professional, a representative of their school, but also a representative of their family and their adopted community. These students were conscious of the multifaceted levels of their own identities. As shown in their application photos, African American women presented themselves to be respectable, poised, and polished, much like their white counterparts' image. They strove to be included in a school to further themselves, but also their community. Through digitizing documents from Douglass Hospital, along with the diaries from Clymer and Littlefield, we see the story of the boundaries women as nurses crossed, as well as the empowerment they created for themselves and for their profession. Nursing allowed women to working with different social and racial constraints to construct meaningful and important lives. And at the same time, it encouraged them to move beyond their broader conventions of their time, place, and embrace broader political and social initiatives. By digitizing these documents and having a mechanism for placing them online, it opens how the layers of information in these stories can be used, whether that's in scholarly work, classroom work, or general knowledge. It takes the collections from the silos of nursing history and opens it to wider inclusion into gender, medical, and economic arenas. Nursing has had a long and complicated history that is often overlooked or simplified, and by being able to digitize these materials and make them online, it amplifies the stories of nursing, nurses, and healthcare, and the connections to today. Nurses traditionally don't view their work as historical or groundbreaking, and for many, what they do and how they do it is just their work, and they don't think about how their stories can be saved to an archive or be made available for researchers. They're often proud of their education and their work, but they don't see the importance of it. Through digitizing, our goal is to make their work and experiences relevant, both of the time and the connections to the present. And you can find all these materials, as Margaret mentioned, on In Her Own Right. And so I will stop it here and send it back to Margaret.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Let me get my notes again. I always, even though our collections with the Bates Center overlap, I never know very much about nursing. We're much more focused on physicians, so I have learned a lot as we have prepped for the project. And I have a particular question I want to ask Jessica as we after I'm done, which looks at sort of the contrast of physician and nurses' experiences. So let me share my screen, and I'm going to ask you all to tell me how it looks. Okay, are you seeing my browser window? All right, hopefully it's good. There's nothing on it at the moment. I have a story to share. It's one of my favorite stories from our collections because I can imagine it happening in the 1800s. You know what, let me just stop this share for a second because it's gonna make more sense. For this story, for me, creates a picture of the environment that women experienced when they ventured from societal norms. It also shows how women can stir up the status quo. It's a story that's been told a lot of times, and we're beginning to translate it for virtual classroom use. My setup here looks a lot like what Melissa had shown. I sort of failed with getting the document camera to work, but it's trying to virtualize what we have traditionally done in person, and you all can see today if I can have any success with that. There's pieces that do and don't translate. One thing you might think about while I'm talking is, why does this matter? In classic archivist fashion, I'm here to present the materials. I will show you as clearly as I can what they are in digital and virtual form. And it's for you as the users to draw your own conclusions. So use the chat for comments and questions, and hopefully we can get some discussion going later on. So now I will actually go back to sharing my screen. Blank at the moment. But I have a couple of questions for you. So first off, there's a Slido poll, and you can either hold up your mobile device or go to slido.com and add the code. The question for you is, who amongst us has been to a woman physician? All right, well, as we approach halfway, I'll go ahead and call it. I'm gonna say that seeing a woman physician for this crowd at this symposium is a relatively common experience. It is not an unusual experience. Why don't you all keep, if you haven't registered your position there, keep doing so, and I'll come back and look at the total. But I wanna go on and ask you the next question, which is, what percentage of physicians, or do you think in, you're gonna get a chance to actually answer the question for current, but I'll start with saying how many physicians or what percentage of women physicians are there in the United States? So about 100 years ago-ish, in 1915, about 5% of physicians in the US were women. So my question for you then now is, what percentage do you think make up, what percentage of women make up the population today of physicians? So let's try this. I'm not sure how well it's gonna work, but if you can add your answer in the chat, what percentage today of physicians are women? And let's just see how this goes. And I know not everybody has chat, but there we go. At least get a handful of these. This will be interesting. Thank you guys for being so game to give this a shot. Nice. We got some really random numbers too. We got some round numbers. We have some people who are cheating, who know the collections. Okay, all right, this is pretty interesting. All right, so I'll go ahead and call it. We've got a range from, it looks like maybe 15% up to 60%. And some people nailed it. So right now we have, well, this is 2017. This is the most recent statistic. It's about 35% of the physicians in the United States are women. And that number pre-17 didn't change much. It's about right around there now. Thank you for participating in the chat. That was to give you some context for talking about the mid-19th century. So in 1850, I'm sure everybody knows this, there was only one woman with a medical degree, an official formal medical degree, and that was Elizabeth Blackwell, who had gotten her degree just a year earlier from Geneva Medical College in New York. In Philadelphia at that time, there were 4 medical schools for men, with Penn and Jefferson being the longest established and most prestigious. But a newcomer came on the scene that year. A group of Quaker leaders and Philadelphia businessmen opened Female Medical College of Pennsylvania. This was the first medical school in the world where women could get an MD, and later they would change their name to Women's Medical College, or Women's Med, which is how I'm generally going to refer to it. So my story today is about Women's Med and about Ann Preston and the students that she led. This is Ann Preston, who graduated in the first class at Women's Med in 1852. She grew up in a Quaker family in Chester County and was involved in anti-slavery and temperance activities. Today, we would absolutely call her an activist. And she taught physiology and hygiene to women. In a great example of cross-collection discovery and one of the opportunities of In Her Own Right, if you search in Her Own Right for Ann Preston, in addition to what's in our collections and what's there from the Chester County History Center, you'll get letters written from and to women's rights and abolition activist Lucretia Mott from the Swarthmore collections. Here, Preston's writing to Mott, and she mentions wanting to discuss her temperance work. After graduating, Preston practiced privately in the area, and she joined the Women's Med faculty. Again, she taught physiology and hygiene. And in 1866, she became the dean at Women's Med, the first woman to become a medical school dean in the country, probably anywhere. In another letter in Her Own Right, this is from Haverford, Philadelphia artist, educator, and abolitionist Sarah Mapps Douglas appreciates Preston for her clarity in teaching physiology. She mentions bringing great truths, which is an interesting line to say about teaching medicine. Douglas took a course of lectures at Women's Med, but she didn't complete a degree, which was not unusual at the time. Preston founded Women's Hospital of Philadelphia in 1861. This is the Women's Hospital that Jessica refers to that started a school for nursing. And here the woman's means that women were treating women and children, providing both healthcare services and training opportunities, including nurses. And they were located on North College Avenue, a couple of miles from the center of downtown. At this time, clinical lectures were a key component of medical education, and Blockley and Pennsylvania hospitals hosted lectures for male students where actual cases were demonstrated live. While the women students studied anatomy, as you see here, and did have clinical opportunities at Women's Hospital, Preston wanted them to gain experience beyond female patients and beyond women's health issues. The male-dominated profession openly objected to women practicing medicine, and this was no exception. They didn't want them to come to the clinical lectures, but Preston was really determined that she would gain this opportunity for her students. It took a year of campaigning, and eventually she secured permission for the women students to attend a lecture in the amphitheater at Pennsylvania Hospital on a Saturday in November 1869. These are not the tickets to the November clinic, but they are from that period. To attend the lecture, you had to buy a ticket for $2 per clinic that you then, actually, I was thinking that you gave them up, but I'm not so sure about that because we have a lot of lecture tickets in our collection, as I think everybody does who is contributing for the health of the new nation. So they were going to the clinic for the lecture. I'm going to stop the screen share because I want to show you something that I couldn't show you on the document camera. But this is one benefit of virtual presentations. I can show you things that I wouldn't bring to a conference. This is an album of, it's a scrapbook of clipping pages. I will open it up and show it to you. This scrapbook documents what happened to the women when they went to the lecture. There are 2 volumes. This is the second one. It's still sort of bound, or at least has the cover. I just want to show you how thick it is. This is the second volume. It gets into 1870. The first volume is from 1869, and it's all in Mylar. It's no longer bound. But you can see there's dozens and dozens of articles here. What's unique about them is every one of these articles talks about what happened to the women at the lectures that day. And we'll see this a little bit more up close and personal, but in 1 second. But within her own right, we were able to digitize both volumes 100%. We had done a percentage of them before, mostly to support telling this story. But now we have all of the clippings digitized in their entirety, and all of the clipping scrapbooks that we have up to 1920 that were all done for In Her Own Right. So let me come back to sharing my screen and we can actually get into the story itself. Here though are the, you know, Mitch was dropping links in. I can drop this into the actual scrapbooks. Oops, sorry, hang on 1 second. Not Q&A, but chat. Here we go. They're really worth exploring. I find more and more things continually that are details about this experience, which I should tell you about. So let's get there. Okay, I want to show you first. In Her Own Right, another way we have for getting at materials is a map that charts locations where documents originated or represent in their content. So if we go in here and zoom in, can everybody see the map okay? Can somebody from the panel let me know if you can't? Here's Girard College, and Women's Med was just above Girard College. At this time, they actually had, their classrooms were rented rooms in the hospital. They didn't have a building at the moment. So we can see here there are 27 documents. I know that these all have to do with Women's Med. And if you go down far enough, you can eventually see, and this one goes, you can click on them and get to see the search results in her own right. But I also wanted to just sort of talk about this location, where they are. So this is at Girard College. Down here is Center City and City Hall. And if you go down far enough, at 8th and Spruce, about in here, is where Pennsylvania Hospital was. So the women would have, they may have been in that area, they probably lived in that area, they could have been coming from somewhere else, but from Women's Med to Pennsylvania Hospital, it's about 2.5 miles. They likely would have taken streetcars and walked to get there. And when they got to 8th and Spruce, they would have had to climb to the top story of the hospital, which is where the amphitheater was, and it was lit by sunlight or daylight. It may not have been sunny, but it was daylight. This is the renovated amphitheater at Pennsylvania Hospital. There's debate about whether this is the same amphitheater where the women were, but it is extant, and it's a wonderful opportunity to get a feel for the clinical lecture environment. The students would pack in on the benches all the way up to the top at this level, where there's actually 2 levels to sit. And to get there, you had to go up this small, dark, curving stairway, which you can still do today once the pandemic's over. I don't know if you can visit right now. So this is what they did. They crawled up there. A populated amphitheater would look like this. This is a little later, and it's Hahnemann. It's not at Pennsylvania Hospital, but it's a wall of men observing a procedure. The articles tell a story of what happened when the women arrived, with a lot of variation of detail, but with consistent themes. When we do this with groups, we usually ask for volunteers to read excerpts from the articles, but in the interest of time, I'm going to read them. And I'm going to try and keep up with our time. So this is the first article, The Late Scene at Pennsylvania Hospital. When the ladies entered the amphitheater, they were greeted by yells, hisses, caterwaulings, mock applause, offensive remarks upon personal appearance, etc. During this last hour, various rude manifestations were made. Missiles of paper, tinfoil, tobacco quids, etc. were thrown upon the ladies, while some of these men defiled the dresses of the ladies near them by spurting tobacco juice upon them. It is but just to the ladies to say they maintained a quiet, modest demeanor and seemed to realize their dignity as women and their position as scientific students. It is quite evident from their general appearance that none of them had ever been accustomed to the association of such unmannerly men before. There were a few men who seemed mortified and chagrined at the phase of affairs, but they could do nothing against the rabble. It is to be hoped that this narrow-minded policy will have died a natural death before next Saturday, and each man will remember his own mother or sisters before he joins in insulting women of virtue and intelligence. The clinical lectures were held every Saturday. So that is one point of view describing what happened. I'm going to read one more and then talk about it a little bit. This is the other side, and this was written a week later. I was present at the Pennsylvania Hospital last Saturday week, and having beheld the alleged assault on these 34, volunteered to relate the circumstances. Being the only person present from Camden, I am better qualified to do so than writers absent from and entirely ignorant of the affair. I was there throughout the whole, and positively assert that no one in female attire was hissed, hooted, or insulted. Who is this shameless herd of sexless beings who dishonor the garb of ladies? This beardless set of non-blushers who infest the rights of 400 regular medical students who have sustained the clinics from their foundation, who in their indecent effrontery would compel us to witness clinical exposures in their presence. This neuter 34 who have shamed common decency by their unwelcome and uninvited presence to the disgust of every student and the loathing of the instructors, who by their immodest persistence have shamed all gentlemen from these clinics, whose lewdness has caused comments, not only from the clinical professors who do not recognize their presence as medical students, but also the contempt of all refined ladies, and in whomever else exists a spark of instinctive modesty. I do not mean to assail the character of this genderless mass. I would not attack anything so weak. Yet I would ask in true candor whether the feelings of our refined lady acquaintances would be exalted towards us if these unblushing beings were to become our associates. All right, pretty colorful language, some great stuff to pick up on in there. But what happened? 30-some women went to the lecture, 300 to 400 men were there, and they were unwelcoming. The articles that I showed, well, the articles I read have two different points of view. The articles I showed you have multiple accounts of the whole event, but both of these two articles describe the women students being greeted and treated with disdain. The first article is criticizing the men's behavior. The second article faults the women for coming to the clinic at all, just feeling that they shouldn't be there. Other articles provide different details, including the sequence of the cases that were observed that day and a possible specific point that may have triggered the men's behavior, the exposing of a male patient's groin area. So as you think about this, having had a glimpse of all those articles and trusting me that they're all about this incident, the question is, do you think that the bulk of the articles side with the women or side with the men? So it's a basic comparison, looking at the behavior of the men and the behavior of the women. And you can head back to Slido. I have to activate this poll. And let me know, do you think public opinion came down on the side of the women or the men? Great, keep it up. This is probably not going to be as easy as the who's seen a women physician. It's going to be worth just giving it a minute to see what kind of turnout we get here. Okay, that's 44 reporting. Oh my gosh, this is like the election. All right, we've got 80% think that public opinion came down against the women in the men's favor, and 20% think that the women were favored. So you all were against public opinion, or what you thought the public thought. The majority of you got it wrong, essentially. The public thought that the behavior of the men was worse than the behavior of the women. So this discussion in the newspapers was national, and it went on for weeks. I say even months, because it literally does go to May of the following year, from November to May. And we did an analysis of all the articles, which we refer to this incident as the jeering incident. The far majority of the articles support the women. While the idea of women working professionally as physicians or attending a clinical lecture, specifically in this case, was seen as against the grain and wasn't widely accepted, the men's behavior was considered more outrageous than the women's interests. The event itself and the press coverage resulting created a turning point in the perception of women training to become physicians, and it was now in the women's favor. So this picture is later, and what do you see that's different? It's all women. In 1869, the national response to the women going to the clinic ultimately assisted Anne Preston in her drive to create balanced opportunities for the women medical students, shifting public opinion to support women studying medicine. The women attended clinical lectures for several months with the men, undergoing much debate in the press, and I'm sure publicly in general, until May 1870, when Pennsylvania Hospital agreed to gender segregated clinics. At the same time, the AMA stated it did not recognize female physicians, and male physicians who connected themselves with female medical schools could not be AMA members. This happened in exact conjunction with the jeering incident. So that is our basic lesson about what women were going through at that time. In closing, I want to note that the jeering incident, and this gets to a lot of what Melissa talked about and why Beth and Kelsey prompted the silence in the lambs as the theme here. The jeering incident is heavily documented. And we can use the documentation to understand viewpoints of the time. There's lots of opportunities for all levels of students and scholars to interpret and gain from the online material. But as we know, not all events are as well documented. The women who attended the November lecture were all white, and likely all the men too, and generally from well-off families. Still, they did have a challenging road ahead of them in working against societal norms. But the abundance of documentation here accentuates other gaps. 2 years prior to this incident, in 1867, Rebecca Cole graduated from Women's Med. She was the second Black woman to earn a medical degree in the United States. We know she practiced medicine for a long time, but there aren't many records left to tell her story. Another Black woman physician, Eliza Greer, graduated later in the 1890s, and we have piecemeal records of her career, mostly because she reached out for help to Susan B. Anthony. But it's a really sparse record for a woman who worked professionally. And both of those cases are a strong contrast to the robust scrapbook that we have documenting this incident that represents white women. So we have an opportunity and a responsibility in the digital realm. In recent years, we learned that the Dr. Greer documentation was more than we thought, not from our collections, but we were able to uncover more because it was digitized by another repository in Georgia. And we now have to incorporate that into the story that we tell online. And it's a more complete picture. So I think that the opportunities are great to eventually, I think Melissa said, where there are silences, how do we bring people in to help fill them when we don't have the actual records that will do so. So the aim of In Her Own Right is to help build and discover more connections and hopefully help fill some of those silences and gaps, and ultimately increase the use of primary sources by all types of users. So I'm going to stop my share, and I don't know if we've got questions. I have a couple of Jessica and I have a couple things we want to ask each other. I'm just going to look in the chat for a minute. One of the things that came up when Jess and I were talking about the presentations is what there were. I've seen photographs of nurses in the clinical lectures, and they were women. They may not be as early as the 1860s, but they're 1890s at the latest. And so one of my questions for you is, why was that okay? Or was it okay? Was it as early as that? And was there a difference in how the nurses were perceived than the women as physicians were perceived?
Sure, it's a great question to ask. And this is my interpretation of it. So if someone else has an opinion or a question about it, feel free to add it to the chat box. But during this time was the early start of nursing training schools. And what that meant was that women were being trained scientifically in a job that anyone probably could do. But for doctors, they were teaching white women of a middle-class era how to do a specific task. And there was a frame and a logic behind it. So they were comfortable in these nurses in a hospital setting to know what to do and have a scientific background in that task. That was still something that women were considered to be doing themselves anyway. So while it was a boundary they were crossing into this medical field in a different way, in a professional way, it was still very much within their gender norm. It still would have been something they were seen as doing naturally, even though it was challenging. Nightingale was challenging how nursing should be done. It was still very much within this sphere. And we see that moving on into the 1920s and 1930s when we start pushing what the nurse-doctor ratio is and what that boundary is. But that's something that gets developed and is still fought with in some ways today. So it's something that started back then and was more appropriate for women to become nurses than women to become doctors.
Yeah, it's still against the norm. Yeah, okay. That is awesome. Beth is telling me that we have a 4-minute warning. So I just want to, Jessica, I'm thinking that maybe we'll just look in the chat and see what's there. Does that sound okay?
works for me.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just seeing, all right, Anna, I'm trying to see what you're saying, and you're happy to be wrong about something, but I don't see what was wrong. Okay, all right, I'll just go back up to the top. Heather says that women comprise 50% of all medical students. And there's a difference between student proportions to actual practicing physicians. And so I'm always careful about which numbers I'm using. That's a good point. Let's see. Beth has a question. Is that because of contemporary consideration of what gentlemanly behavior should be? Do you think our response is due to our modern biases? Oh, interesting. So the whole question in the poll about some people, I was asking, how do you think public opinion landed? But it's also, you can interpret as, well, what do I think? What do I think happened? So I don't know about the answer to our modern biases in how we answered that question specifically. Certainly the nuance of the men's behavior and what was considered gentlemanly and what would be insulting to women, the men took it too far for the times. They took it too far, and that was why the women were favored. Okay, so Anna says, she thought the public would have sided with the men who characterized the female med students as sexless, the same way suffragists were represented. That's a really good point. I think that that one article, it's really heavy-handed in the sexlessness of it, and is really saying that you can't be womanly and be here. And that is how suffragists, that was a main characterization. But yet, this is maybe because it's earlier and suffrage did eventually succeed. So maybe there's a more of a balance there in that time in the 1860s. And then lastly, Heather says that nurses were seen as helpers in the surgical arena, not as professionals. I think that that's very much what Jessica was saying, and how nursing is a continuation or an extension of what women did and not really outside the sphere at that time. We are down to 1 minute. Jessica, do you want to say anything else there before Beth kicks us out?
I think it's a good note to land on, the different interpretations of what these documents say and what can be done when they're put online for anyone to view. Really creates different narratives.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think one of the challenges is, how do you mediate the narrative at the same time as there's a lot less mediation when you're in the online environment. So how do you both support some navigation of the material without overpowering with opinion? So we'll stop there, and thank you all for paying attention and staying focused with the chat and the Slido polls.
Thanks, Margaret and Jessica. We have 5 minutes for any additional questions and answers before we take a break. And I'm actually going to pose one question to Melissa and Margaret and Jessica, and probably to the future presenters as well, because it's something that has reared its head as we all begin to consider how to bring out the hidden voices in our collections. And the question that was posed directly to Melissa was, is Yale collecting material to fill in any of the gaps that you noted in your presentation?
So one of the things I wanted to mention with the presentation is that I think that the reason why consortial agreements work so well is that I don't have to have everything, in the collection on every aspect. I can turn to Drexel, who has a wonderful women in medicine collection, right? I can turn to Cornell, which has a great sexuality collection. I can turn to other places that are they're collecting so well that I don't feel like I need to jump into that game. Should I have some representative collections? Perhaps, but I think it works well as a large group if we can get together and think about which kinds of themes our different institutions already collect so well and go from there.
I'm going to show my age. I don't know how many of you will remember something that came out of the New York State Archives in the late 80s by the state archivist, and it was, oh, good heavens, now it's out of my head. It was cooperative description. And it will come to me. It'll come to me at like 2 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the night. And that's one thing that Larry Hackman put out, and it kind of died a fairly quick death over a couple of years. But I'm wondering if collective description would be a way of bringing out the hidden voices that our own internal descriptions can't, but is also missing in digitization projects, because digitization projects tend to be thematic or genre-based. So I'm just going to leave that out there. I'm going to leave that hang out there. Does anybody else have any other questions? Lisa Mix, Towards a Usable Past by Larry Hackman. That might have been the article where he mentions it. The collective describing, he actually came up with a phrase to describe it, and I will have to turn in my New York State Archives alumni card for not being able to remember it. I'll figure it out on the break. Let's take a break right now. We will resume at 2:30. So grab a beverage and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks. Our next presenter, we will now have, let's see, 1, 2, 3 presentations, shorter than the last. The first, entitled Curating History in the COVID-19 Era, Philadelphia Epidemics and 19th Century American Women's Medical Education, is brought to us by Dr. Anne Riccouli, who teaches the history of science, medicine, and technology. Her talk today offers strategies for guiding undergraduate science and public health majors in their study of history during our pandemic pivot, which I think is a great term, to all digital access to primary source documents. And I will turn it over to Anne.
Thank you, Beth. And thanks for, I'm delighted to participate in this program. I'm also happy to follow in the sequence of Margaret and Jessica's talk, who spoke about the medical students. I'd like to add a little bit about what I've learned about the content of some of the lectures and some of their curricular topics, with the idea of training, with the idea of looking at how historians are working with the archives and training students how to do the same. I'd like to share my screen at this point to go to PowerPoint. So I'm looking at today, taking a closer look at the Henry Hartshorne archives housed at the Historical Medical Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Hartshorne's lectures, notes for the seminars at Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania on the topic of what we today call pediatrics, continues our conversations this afternoon about teaching with digital archives. And I'll share my strategies on developing learning goals for history courses, seminars which educate undergraduates on the ways in which historians work and work with archives under the current pandemic restrictions. I first present a brief overview of the Hartshorne document related to his tenure as professor. Classroom discussions can evaluate how primary sources such as the hygiene and medical management of children, shown here, serve as an introduction for college freshmen on historiography. Next, I raise issues my students have brought up regarding authenticity, in particular authenticity of digital primary source documents. And finally, I present a useful theoretical framework on what Michelle Loftrieux has called silences or gaps in the archives. As educators, we're well aware that the typical first-year student studying history was born after the year 2000, and many, if not most, are facile with digital technology. Yet I'm also keenly aware that these students are deeply invested in conversations about truth and trust inherent in all digital environments. I have a degree in museum studies and have constructed archival finding aids. I shared with my students, many of whom are majoring in science, public health, communications, and early childhood education, teaching them ways to evaluate historical practices and critically assess silences or gaps in the archives they're using in their own research. It's precisely because the Henry Hartshorne archives so clearly capture participants' awareness of the rate of change within and among their respective medical school institutions that these documents have value for educators. And in particular, I argue for those teaching distance curricula. Hartshorne's palimpsest offers multiple perspectives, which facilitates students' independent research. As these next generation of scholars anticipates changes faced by exploring the past using virtual platforms. Here are 2 pages from Hartshorne's lecture notes. And scrawled in a hurried handwriting, we see his advice for people he called his scholars, which clearly emphasize emerging ideas about health and sanitation introduced by the new scientific germ theory. At the same time, however, this professor of medicine at Women's Medical College understood all too well the clinical challenges that students might encounter when in the field. And for Hartshorne, a particular urgency was the accurate diagnosis of infectious diseases. The physical exam of patients' mouths, for example, often disclosed evidence of diphtheria, scarlet fever, and measles. Evaluating the younger patients for early diagnostic signs, moreover, presented specific challenges. So reading from his notes, for the throat, more difficulty, the experienced clinician cautioned, suggesting that as medical students examine the children with the handle of a dessert spoon or a moderate-sized ivory paper cutter, in parentheses, wash first. It's important to note that the women medical students receive practical advice, including sanitizing household implements, concurrent with laboratory exercises in bacteriology and pharmacology. So these manuscripts serve as a remarkable record of changes in medical school education during the decades surrounding the 1870s, as the city's physician professors adapted curricula to recently discussed notions that microscopic bacteria cause disease. Both faculty and students remarked on tensions resulting as schools incorporated new advances in diagnosis, treatment, and extended classroom hours, and navigated increased competition for limited clinical rotation experiences. The pace of this shift, as Stephen Peitzman, Naomi Rogers, and others have noted in their examination of the physical archival documents, the pace exerted pressures which served to advance medical education in post-Mellon Philadelphia. And this progress was clearly noted at the time. Hartshorne addressed the University of Pennsylvania Medical School faculty on the anniversary of the institution's inclusion of basic science instruction. Hartshorne saw the merits of engaging with available good working theory in both the daily practice of clinical medicine and within plans to initiate public health programs. At the same time, however, the professor cautioned his audience on the risks associated with complacency, accepting as dogma newly received information without applying critical thinking. The Hartshorne papers document this physician's effort to convey to his students at Women's Medical College precisely these goals of responding to acute crisis of infectious disease in Philadelphia populations, and more broadly to discern what continue to merit attention for the health and hygiene of children. So Hartshorne introduces women medical students to the specific requirements demanded of working with these younger populations. And his input was based on clinical observations of children, both during routine and emergency encounters. As many of the documents in this archival set demonstrate, handwritten pages show additions and edits, perhaps for didactic clarity, but also recording changes in opinion, practice, and methods. In particular, Hartshorne's lecture notes stress that students develop their own critical observation skills. On the sheet titled here, Medicines Especially Available for Children, Hartshorne included the caveat, according to my experience. And of note are the consistent references that the treatment of children required, above all, restraint. Dosing and therapeutic measures stress the ways in which these patients differed from the adult population, with caveats for the administration of medicine as small doses and maximum, not too much. So my students today in the classroom, whether online or in person, read these documents digitally and can trace the processes through which the theory and practice converged prior to the formal recognition of pediatric medicine. Hartshorn's notes also demonstrate public health matters relevant to practitioners in Philadelphia. So here we see several sets of lecture notes coming up with multiple annotations as he crafted his own index for scarlet fever, diphtheria, and other childhood diseases. And as an historian, I find a particular note as I prepare educational materials for my students, his reference to previously published works in his own documents. So for example, in the etiology folder, he referenced my book on cholera. Hartshorn also annotated his Memorandum Medica, shown here, marked now out of print. In this particular folder, we see letters, newspapers, clippings, journal articles, and his own statistics from the perspective of an experienced clinician, capturing the emergence of documenting yellow fever and capturing the emergence of what was subsequently termed the fourth wave of cholera. So students accessing evidence of the professionalization of public health in the United States can document Philadelphians' fears regarding the pending reemergence of pandemic cholera, here concurrent with the shift to science-based medical education. Finally, historians and students of history can learn much from textbooks and examination records. Here we have sets of exam questions which document broader themes which professors stressed in their lectures. In the pages of these archives, we see issues ranging from racial science and disability to the impact of climate on population health and yellow fever. Women's medical college students were asked to evaluate the construction of conduits for Pennsylvania's Schuylkill River water supply, for example. So for my undergraduate students studying American progressive era social and cultural history, these documents substantiate current historical scholarship and suggest further avenues for research into physicians' engagement with social concerns in the final decades of the 19th century. In informal conversations with my students, they shared that they did think critically about historical methods in the digital environment. Their concerns centered on two main themes navigating the volume of information available: that of document originality and issues of trust or authenticity. The manner in which Hartshorn engaged with his students at Women Medical College, the cohort he regarded as our scholars, may serve as a template for educators seeking to engage today's students in contemporary research methods. My students asked for guidance on when to stop reading digital documents. In other words, they asked how historians know when they're finished researching and when they begin writing. And I think these points are especially salient in the digital realm, where there's no sense of holding that archival box in your hand and knowing when you reach the end of a set of documents. For this generation, the overwhelming volume of evidence available online presents issues of time management. Many speak of searching for that last key document, or the one that will connect or unify their research into a coherent whole. In my virtual classroom, the breakout room and discussion board platforms require that students present concise summaries of their argument in 5 minutes or less in one PowerPoint slide, and to require peer review and feedback. So put simply, presenting research in this learning management style format, I think gives these students the opportunity to offer argument-based summaries of their curated evidence. The idea that they're not going to be able to get through all of the materials available online, but need to bring in enough to demonstrate their own argument and their own points. In addition, my students asked if document originality mattered when conducting research. They're conscious of the circulation of material access through online platforms. They're conscious of the idea that documents can be altered, copied, manipulated. And they suggest that duplicate presentations of images rather diluted or minimized historical relevance. And I have a problem with this. This is a key finding that emphasizes that education is needed from the archives point of view about the labor involved in constructing, maintaining, and accessing digital archives that are derived from physical materials. So for scholars of a certain generation who, with a working knowledge of what it's like to be in a pre-digital research world, the scanned and uploaded documents, such as the etching and the handwritten text shown here, represent a facsimile. Originality is reserved for the source maintained on site. However, in the age of restricted access and travel, my students infer that the burden of proof for document originality and authenticity rests with the viewer, the on-screen viewer, and not with the archives or museum website or content provider. So they feel it's their job to guarantee authenticity and not to trust the sources that have been uploaded. And here too, archive professionals can supplement previous emphasis on firsthand observation. For example, Hartshorn's advice to clean the paper cutter before using it in the child's mouth, with education designed to increase trust and document integrity. Finally, my students were aware that they access digital documents in medias res, if you will, with perhaps additional items will come up later at some future point, that they're not looking at a complete set of anything if things are in the process of being uploaded. And part of the access templates they're using reinforces this idea that documents are viewed at a moment of time of archival collection. And I think that conversations about how archivists work would be useful to clarify the issues for these students. In conclusion, the value of teaching historiography, historical working methods, archival materials, and the scholarship involved with the analysis is more relevant now than ever. Students must be able to assess the extent to which historians' access to materials has changed, and to evaluate the impact on a range of historical output, from books and monographs to film documentaries, from textbooks to blog posts. How do historians evaluate online data, and what new frameworks are needed to negotiate the gaps in these digital archival records? Silences, as anthropologist Michelle Rolfe-Trio has cautioned, enter the process of historical production at 4 crucial moments. For Trio, exclusions and erasures from the historical record can occur at the time of the event. Silences also continue during the document collection, subsequent access to curated collections, and finally during interpretation. My talk this afternoon has opened a conversation about issues of access and supports students as they challenge the notion that increased availability of archives, or what Trio called the moment of fact retrieval, is subordinate to personal investigations of specific documents. I've argued that the learning management system's template for collaborative engagement with primary source materials may provide a virtual space in which student curators can cancel silences with alternative perspectives. As Beth earlier mentioned, documentation strategies or collective descriptions. Issues raised in the conversations I presented here, I claim, will continue to resonate as additional archives are digitized and made available to researchers. My scholars grapple with this idea or question about digital scholarship, one that Margaret had raised earlier about archives. To what extent will historic output from this period be different? And why does that question matter? Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back. And I realize that I have apologies for the audio at that moment.
Thank you very much, Anne. Does anyone have a specific question? I posted a general question in the chat, which perhaps I'll save until we're done with this segment. But does anybody have any specific questions of Anne?
I see a chat from Margaret Graham about making meaning of the untidy notes. Beth and I had talked about this. I'm actually kind of intrigued by Hartshorn's scribbling. You know, I had worked with archives earlier, and the more closely I looked, the more I'm hooked by what he's revealing in these layers. He really is capturing this shift. What I did not have a chance to, looking at the time as well, didn't have a chance to go into was really an awareness that I have of how much former views of medicine are still maintained at this particular moment in time. For example, he's looking at the personality types of the students as having galenic tendencies. So they're phlegmatic, they're emphatic. I did not expect to see that in the same page as germ theory.
Seriously, why are you surprised that humoral theory is raising its head in the 1870s? I'm actually not surprised at all.
Yeah, I was surprised to see it in writing. And also his characterizations of I'm not familiar enough with the attendees in Mellon College, but I'm sure anyone who's doing a biographical search would benefit from reading these works as well, because he mentions by name individual students. Yeah, thank you. Looking, Beth, do you see other questions that I am overlooking at this point?
Other than my general ones, which I think I'll save. I do not see any other questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you.
And Anne works at a wonderful university, Drew University, which is my alma mater. So I had to just throw that in. We're going to be moving on to a presentation about the value of objects as primary sources. And that's something that I think we in general library and archives land don't often think about with as much intent as we should. The next presentation is Digital Lives Beyond the Anatomical, Pathological, and Surgical Specimen. And our presenter is Dr. Paula Summerly, who currently manages the Old Red Medical Museum project at the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston. Her academic background is in the history of medicine, osteology, paleopathology, and photography. She has curated several exhibitions, including A Healing Passion at the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow, and served as a curatorial consultant on temporary exhibitions, including Forensics, the Anatomy of Crime at the Wellcome Collection in London. And I will turn it over to Paula.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be taking part in the symposium. As Beth mentioned, I'm interested in objects, primarily specimen collections, and I'm really interested in the lives and the deaths of the individuals who are preserved in jars or desiccated collections and so on and so forth. So this is a photograph of Old Red, or the official name, the Ashbel Smith Building, which is at the heart of UTMB's Galveston campus. So given the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston is a bit of a mouthful, I'll just abbreviate it to UTMB from henceforth. So I'm going to be discussing two student-driven research projects, one called Stilled Lives and the other called Adopt a Specimen Initiative, both centered on UTMB's historical, anatomical, pathological, and surgical specimen collections, as well as contextual archive and library sources. So UTMB houses approximately 2,000 late 19th to early 20th century historical specimens. The collections are the remnants of 3 former museums established in 1891 and disbanded during the 1950s, primarily due to shifts in the curriculum, as well as the increasing use of imagery and shifts in medical education. A small number of specimens from across the collections are utilized in laboratory demonstrations to the present day, and currently the collections are not readily accessible to visitors. However, bona fide researchers can request permission to see the collections via UTMB's Collection Commission, a group of UTMB employees with representatives from the Old Red Medical Museum Project, the Department of Pathology, Legal Affairs, Marketing and Communications, who follow a series of prescribed protocols. In the near future, the specimen collections will form the vision of a new medical museum on the 3rd floor of Old Red. The museum will be housed in the former dissection laboratory. The format of the museum, whether one featuring traditional exhibits and/or integrating immersive educational and digital technologies, is being developed through the efforts of an interdisciplinary committee of staff, faculty, students, the community, as well as university leadership. Over the past few years, the collections have been organized and inventoried and photographed and assessed by several conservators. This data was created for collections management purposes, not as a public search tool or for digital surrogacy. Nevertheless, the searchable inventory and photo archive are vitally important, not only for record-keeping purposes and for teaching and research inquiries, but also as a key source of information during the pandemic. In her 2017 article entitled "The Aura of Materiality, Digital Surrogacy and the Preservation of Photographic Archives," Jasmine E. Burns argues that, quote, "the process of digitization brings forth a new object into existence," end quote. However, I will argue this new object, in this particular instance, a photograph of a specimen, is a secondary substitute for the original. And in a twist of virtual irony, I'm unable to share the original specimens with you in this presentation, just merely their photographic representation. However, digitizing primary sources allows researchers to create what I call digital links between contextual sources and across institutions, which may pose interesting prospects for future research. The Stilled Lives Minimester is a 2-week elective devised for UTMB medical students. The research protocol afforded participants an opportunity to undertake self-directed research on 2 historical specimens. By utilizing visual clues, including numbers etched on the glass jars and on text on handwritten labels, the students were able to begin to link an individual specimen to an array of sources, including autopsy protocols, drawings, and newspaper archives and archival manuscripts. Students attended a brief training course on research methods showcasing digital sources that were relevant to their specimen-focused research. A close reading of the specimen alongside a diverse array of historical sources afforded students an opportunity to go beyond the anatomist, pathologist, or surgeon's view of the specimen. Stilled Lives was designed to equip students with practical skills necessary to conduct research on the specimen collections and to generate awareness of both medical and social history as important contributors to healthcare practice today, and to appreciate the ethical and legal complexities of researching, curating, and displaying specimens. To that end, the Minimester combines lectures, readings, discussions, guest speakers, active workshops, and student presentations. The students documented their specimen narratives in illustrated PowerPoint presentations, which were then graded by faculty course members. Students not only learned about anatomy, pathology, and surgery, but also about the often silenced life and death of an individual, which in turn enhanced the students' capacity for empathy and the human condition, as evidenced by the students' feedback. And this is a photograph of one of the historical surgical pathology specimens, which was part of the Still Lives Many Mister. It's a complete crush of the 6th cervical level fracture or dislocation of the spinal cord. The accompanying sources housed in several archives outline the circumstances regarding the injury to the individual. This individual was a medical doctor who worked in Tampico, Mexico in 1920. His spine was severed by the upward motion of a handle of a railway cord. He was paralyzed and transported from Tampico to Galveston over a period of four days in a container ship. He arrived at the John Seeley Hospital in Galveston and died the following day. No surgical intervention was offered. And this is a little drawing from the company surgical pathology report, which links from the specimen number etched on the jar to this report. And from this little drawing here and these diagrams, we can link to other sources. So we have drawings from a digitized collection here at the Moody Medical Library at UTMB in Galveston, and that all link to the case, and the numbers all transfer, and that allows you to sort of get a sort of better idea of the individual's life and death. Here's some more sources and a publication. So this is what I kind of call digital linking, from the blocker archives here to publications and so on. This is an even more complicated example of digital linking. And this is one of the first specimens I really got to thinking about linking specimens to contextual sources. It probably looks really chaotic and confusing. At the center is a jar of ephemeral bubo, essentially. And on the top of the jar, there's a number etched on the lid, and that number corresponds to an autopsy protocol. So these are departmental records. We have a plague laboratory notebook in the blocker archives at the Moody Medical Library, and that gave details of the individual's name, where he lived, the onset of the disease. Using that data, we could go to Ancestry to find the death certificate, and then a trawl of online gravestones and local cemeteries. We could find the gravestone. We also discovered by looking through city records that rat proofing was introduced, and that's an example at the bottom left-hand corner of rat proofing in a former corner store. We have microscope slides. So this is what I kind of described as digital linking. And just to extend this particular linkage here, we were involved in a temporary exhibit at the Bryan Museum, which is also in Galveston. It's a museum dedicated to Texas history. And you can see here, we've got local photographs reproduced from the blocker archive. Eventually we added images from the Wellcome Trust, which is a really free and fantastic resource. So we used drawings by A.L. Tarter, and we exhibited microscope slides and a rat trap complete with desiccated rats. And ironically, this temporary exhibit was installed around February 2020. It was meant to run for 3 months, and it was deinstalled last week because the museum closed and we couldn't get the items back. Not that we needed them, but that just shows you an unexpected consequence of creating an exhibit and not being aware that a pandemic was on the horizon. So I'm going to move on to the second initiative, which is the Adopt a Specimen initiative, which was devised by 2 UTMB alumni and launched in 2018 to raise much needed funds to conserve the historical specimens. And over the past 2 years, we've raised over $100,000 in donations to conserve the specimens. Gold level donors giving $10,000 or more, and silver level donors giving $5,000 or more could virtually adopt a specimen of their choice based on the subject matter or the conservation needs of the particular specimen. High-level donors were provided with a story of the specimen researched by a student from across UTMB's schools of medicine, nursing, biomedical sciences, and the Interprofessional Education Scholars Program, using the research protocol devised for the Still Lives Minimester. With the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was no longer possible for students to gain physical access to the specimen collections, archives, and libraries, although things are changing on a daily basis here. Using digital primary sources, perhaps most notably specimen collections, raises several challenges for the researcher. It was important for students to continue with their education alongside these research projects. In fact, the number of students wishing to write specimen stories increased during the pandemic. Digital photographs of specimens or surrogates derived from the photo archive were sent to the students electronically. Access to the files was given and password protected. Each student had previously signed an agreement not to circulate the photograph of the specimen for personal use, noting that once the photographs are liberated, it is difficult to manage how the images are used without having guidelines in place to protect the specimens in the collections. As Burns in her Aura of Materiality article from 2017 notes that the digital surrogate is considered less valuable than the original, and in this example, a specimen, because of some of the senses are compromised, for example, tactility. Ironically, doctors have relied on their senses in diagnosing and treating disease. Medical education has sought to train the senses of students. Those utilizing archival sources also experience a sensory loss, the touch and the smell of rare books, which are often digitized in fragments rather than the whole tome being reproduced. So good quality photographs were vital for both student and faculty, as the medical faculty, checking the accuracy of the student stories of doctor specimens, had to rely on photographs. Quality of the image, the angle, and the lighting was of paramount importance. And I have to mention, obviously, the Modern Museum's project Memento Muta, which has kind of 3D rotations when you can interact with specimens, which is a wonderful project in itself. So one of the students allowed me to share her completed story, which was offered to me last week, and this is what the actual donor will receive. So we've managed to keep these projects going remotely. So the main problem for digital surrogates of specimens is turning the 3D artifact, dimensional artifact, into a two-dimensional photograph. Digital surrogates do, however, have several advantages over the specimen. The remote research process involves limited handling of the specimens as well as archival sources, which eventually may lead to wear and tear on the originals. It is clear the pandemic has forced several practical changes for accessing and utilizing primary sources. Digital surrogates should not take the place of original artifacts, particularly in the context of a traditional museum. However, digital linkage of sources across collections and repositories may impact future research in a positive way, developing and extending contextual historical networks. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paula. I have a feeling that I could put you and Anna Doty, the curator of the Mutter Museum, in your own separate chat room right at the moment. And you two would be perfectly happy.
That would be nice.
Does anyone have any specific questions for Paula? If there are no specific questions, I will then thank Paula for her participation, and I'm glad that everything is good in Galveston and you were able to join us. And we will move on to the last segment, or the last presenter in this segment, and that is Simon Raghavan from Drexel University, who will be talking about a feature, not a bug, designing Archives 101 for the online classroom. And Simon is a lapsed classicist, nothing to be ashamed of. who works at the Drexel University Archives, where he does a little bit of everything, though he has a growing focus on making archival research approachable, useful, and interesting to undergraduates from across the academic disciplines. So Simon, I will turn it over to you.
Before I begin the slideshow, I'm just going to mention that that the images are not like directly tied to what I'm talking about, because it wound up being the points I'm making just don't particularly need or really benefit from being illustrated with specific images. So these are, I've been pulling together images from across our already digitized collections to use for like webinars and classes that we're working on. And so these are some of them that I think have a lot of potential for, for being interesting and useful to students in different disciplines and with different interests. And it's something for you to look at, which hopefully will be, somewhat interesting while I talk. So over the past couple years in the Drexel University Archives, we'd already begun moving away from the show and tell model of the class visit to the archives. The way we'd been doing it, it was to kind of lecture about archives generally, about the material that we laid out on the table for the students to look at, and then giving the students some time at the end to kind of circulate and look through things on their own. Well, answering their questions. And when we had students fill out short anonymous surveys at the end of the visits, feedback was for the most part very positive. But while students seem to find this type of introduction to archives interesting, it isn't a great way to help them develop any of the skills that they would need to do archival research. And so we wanted to kind of, develop a class and develop student assignments based on archival material that were less frustrating and more kind of educational, more pedagogically useful to the students. So early in 2020, we were just starting to revamp our approach. We had plans to create an Archives 101 lesson plan for undergraduate classes, still based around a visit to the reading room. The Drexel University Libraries was conducting a search for the new position of Curricula Support Program Manager, so someone with pedagogical expertise that we lack, and who would be able to assist us in developing the Archives 101 lesson plan. And then the pandemic began. And among the many and various changes that the pandemic has brought, a relatively tiny one that I think is turning out to be an overall positive one is that we have been forced to shift our approach to developing Archives 101. So we are in the process of creating Archives 101 right now with the support of Sam Kirk, the person who was hired as the Curricula Support Program Manager, like just before Drexel shut down the campus. So that's a weird time to start. But she's been incredibly helpful. Anyway, in this talk, I'm not describing in detail the process of creating a complete lesson. And I'm not summing up the results of a complete, like a collaboration with the faculty member and actually implementing a class. So first, I'm going to kind of sketch out the goals for Archives 101 and where we're at with it right now. And then I'll get into the drawbacks and advantages we've encountered so far due to the need to rely on already digitized material. So the overall structure of the class is that first there are 7 short videos that we're creating, which cover foundational topics. Then the lesson plan for the actual class, which archive staff would lead. And then a few assignments based on archival material that are meant to reinforce ideas and to help students practice some archival research skills. And we really are deeply indebted to Sam Kirk in all of this. Speaking personally, I was starting to feel like I was floundering a little bit, and Sam brought structure and focus to the project overall, as well as her expertise. So the videos are very short, no more than about 5 minutes, which is like 625 words. The idea is that they'll save time during the class, and also students can start thinking about these questions, which are probably unfamiliar to them, ahead of time. And the topics include how archives are arranged, why archives are important, and the gaps and silences in the archival record. It is quite a challenge to talk succinctly about any of these topics in such a short time, but we want students to actually watch the videos and also to not overwhelm them with information, because there's a lot we could be saying and a lot we want to tell them, but people can only take in so much information at a time. And so when they're all complete, the videos will be available on YouTube as well as an internal Drexel site that faculty can access. So the plan is we're going to develop 3 versions of Archives 101. One is for a synchronous online class, which includes examining and discussing an item together as a group, a demonstration of how to search on our ArchiveSpace public user interface, and an activity for small groups so they can practice using the ASpace interface. And then there's going to be an asynchronous online module, and then finally one for actual, in-class visits to the archives whenever that becomes possible again. So the intention is that this should be a flexible lesson plan, that we can adapt any of these 3 versions to at least some extent, depending on the goals of the class, the subject that's being taught, whatever. So we could select specific archival items to discuss, which we think will be more appealing to the students based on what they're studying, like their major, the program that they're in, or which are very apt for making a certain point, for developing a certain skill. And we would discuss with faculty how best to incorporate the videos into their curricula. And for the assignments, faculty could use them more or less as is once we finish them, or they can be jumping off points for more customized assignments. So back at the beginning of March, we thought we'd be creating only one version of Archives 101, which would center on an in-person visit to the reading room, and assignments that would involve reading room visits to work with physical materials. Instead, we're starting by working on a lesson plan that is designed to be taught remotely, and assignments which faculty can use and adapt, which don't require a visit to any archives. And eventually we'll actually focus on the in-person version. So what's become clear by this stage is that while there are challenges and we were not expecting at the beginning of the year, and there are some definite drawbacks to introducing students to archival research remotely, there are also advantages and some useful opportunities. And actually, as I was writing this talk, I realized that many of the drawbacks and challenges that we're facing in doing this, they also have potentially positive flip side to them. So I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that teaching how to work with primary sources remotely is different, but not necessarily worse. And so probably the most obvious drawback is the loss of materiality. Not being able to give students the opportunity to actually handle unique historic documents. On the other hand, kind of in my kind of anecdotal experience of having having class visits to the reading room, I found that when we lay a variety of items from our collections on the table, and when the students circulate at the end of, near the end of the class, they tend to focus on the item that is either most immediately comprehensible, which is usually a bound volume from our rare books collection, or something that's whatever's the most, you might say, charismatic, like a very striking image, or something that's both, like an elephant folio with huge high quality engravings, which is an amazing object, but also we don't want students to only be looking at that. And so they understand books already, right? And students of, and photos of student fashion shows, that's, from the 80s or whatever, that's always kind of, that's always going to be interesting. These are things they know how to use and interpret already. They already know how to get information out of them, as opposed to a lot of other kinds of archival material. And it's not intuitive how to interpret archival material. It involves various skills, and we cannot assume that students have them already or that they know how to apply them specifically to archival material. And while it's great to see students get really excited about, you know, an old book or the yearbooks or photos of people in old-fashioned clothes, it's not effective for teaching them the skills they need to conduct archival research themselves. And I think this can lead to kind of frustration when assignments are based on working with archival material. It's kind of throwing them in at the deep end, I think. But an online class may lend itself better to focusing on a specific item together really closely, so we can walk them through the process of how you interpret it, how you find information from it in something, you know, an item that they otherwise would not gravitate towards. And I think it's a better structure for demonstrating how to approach an item. And this is in part because of like the shape and size of our reading room and just the general setup, but I think there's other factors at play as well. And so a problem particular to Drexel University archives is that previous archivists digitized thousands of photos, but very few of them have already been uploaded. And also, relatively little text has already been digitized, and that has mostly been on the basis of a specific research need or some other specific purpose. So it's very piecemeal instead of a whole series of correspondence from a collection has been digitized or something like that. And this makes it more difficult to identify groups of material for students to work with for an assignment. And actually, as of late September, we are back on campus, but only a few hours per week total. And so we can digitize some things for classes, but it's time consuming. So there's a limit to what we can do there right now. But the flip side is that this limitation has made us more open to using material that other repositories have digitized from their collections and made available online. I think we were kind of stuck on the idea that you have to use only material from your own collections when you're you know, teaching a class, but I don't think that has to be the case. And so so being flexible like this can create some new opportunities. Like you can introduce students to the variety of archives that are out there, show them kind of the contrasts in what they have, how they're organized and whatnot. And also start giving them a sense for how to find a collection that is more in line with their own interests at some other repository if we don't have anything that really catches their attention. And maybe they might get the experience of working with material from more than one archive. And another benefit, which hadn't occurred to me previously, is that a class that's delivered entirely remotely is better suited to teaching them how to navigate an archive's website. And just because the undergraduates that we work with don't remember a time when computers were not ubiquitous does not mean that they understand everything digital or everything internet. And definitely that's not the case when it comes to the particularities of an archive's web presence. So, so during an online class, we could introduce students to what to expect on an archive's website, what finding aids are and how to read them, how to do searches in repositories of digitized material, what kind of metadata they can expect to find on the page of an individual digitized item, and what metadata to look for, to expect, and what it means, how they can use it. And they could then have a follow-up assignment that helps them reinforce those skills. So right now it looks likely that we'll be collaborating with a faculty member who's in the English department, and her research and teaching focuses on rhetoric. And in an initial conversation with her, she said that she would really like to work with, to be able to use correspondence from an author. And we have like boatloads of administrative correspondence, but that's kind of like not what her preference would be. So, and we might have something suitable somewhere in our collections that we haven't already identified, and which we would have to digitize. But we could also, you know, just if we're open to using archival material from other repositories, then, you know, that's less work for us. And it also means the faculty member has more options. You know, they're not stuck with just whatever we have. They can choose from some different collections. And we can still incorporate items from our own collections in other ways. So there are definitely aspects of the class visit to the reading room which cannot be replicated or swapped for something that is different but still just as beneficial. For example, sometimes during class visits to the reading room, students we have a near full run of the Drexel yearbooks in the reading room, which are browsable. And sometimes students will take them down, start flipping through them, and you know, it's great. They have a great time. And personally, the yearbooks are probably my favorite kind of type of material you find in a university archives. But the thing is, that can't happen on Zoom, even though most of the yearbooks have been uploaded to our online repository by this point. And then you just lose the impact of handling something old. And I think, you know, it's both kind of an experience that stays with them, you know, that makes archives feel more significant. But also I think it makes the idea of flipping through a box of, you know, early 20th century or late 19th century material, something less intimidating, something that they can do and even enjoy. And so another drawback of doing a class like Archives 101 remotely is that students don't get a sense of the archives as a place where they can go, where hopefully they feel welcomed and receive guidance. It's hard to know what to expect if from a in-person visit, from an appointment, and it's very hard to kind of demystify that aspect of archival research if you're online. We can certainly demystify the archive's web presence, but and I think at this point, you know, the website is, you know, it's like part of the space of an archives. But archives, an entirely remote Archives 101 court class is simply, it's going to remain a partial experience of archival research. There's some things that we cannot reproduce. So I think that more broadly, despite, you know, the challenges, I think that this will be good in the long term for us as a department to already have this experience with creating a class that is done entirely online. We wouldn't have made this a high priority in other circumstances, but we were compelled to figure it out. And so teaching with primary sources doesn't, you know, really have best practices yet, and much less best practices for doing so online. But I think extending our reach like this is really important. It's certainly, you know, a big deal to make as much archival material as is feasible publicly available to people anywhere in the world with internet access and an adequate internet connection. But we also need to figure out how to teach the skills that are necessary to make use of archival material. And I'm coming to see this as an aspect of the overall accessibility of the archives. So I think developing Archives 101 first as an entirely online class is really good practice. And it could turn out to be a useful example for other online only efforts to spread not just digitized versions of archival material, but also to teach the knowledge and skills that people need to make use of them. So, should I stop screen sharing? I will stop screen sharing. That is my talk.
Simon, we have a question for you.
Oh, fantastic.
Could you describe a typical class assignment that involves student research in the archives?
Typical, I mean, so in the past, we've kind of, we've told students, you know, pick a topic that interests you. Sometimes it's been more structured than that. There was a class on the history of like Drexel's diversity history. So there were kind of, I'm not sure exactly how the professor structured it, but basically like it was a bit more guided there. And the problem there is it winds up frustrating in part because they'll be interested in something that we don't have much material for, or it's just hard to find, or we have stuff, but it's like, this is going to take, you do not have time for this. Drexel's on the quarter system, so that's 10 weeks. So it's frustrating when it's kind of going back and forth, being like, we don't have much for this, like, you know, how do you want to do this? And so another thing we're moving toward is maybe more curated kind of choices for what to do research on, at least for Archives 101, where it's more about kind of practicing skills than more advanced stuff. So.
Well, we've just had 3 different presentations where we've gotten different views of exactly as Simon said, that level of curation that is involved in presenting primary source content to students. Does anybody have any questions for either Paula, Ann, or Simon? Okay, if not, we're going to take another 5-minute break. Actually, let's make it about a 7-minute break, and we'll be back at 3:43 with our final session. I'd like to welcome everybody back for the last presentation of our afternoon. It is entitled DBQ, Document-Based Quarantine, which is for the win. Sorry, everybody else, but that's pretty awesome. I would like to introduce Celia Kaust-Ellenbogen, who is the archivist and manages the primary source instruction program at the Friends Historical Library of Swarthmore College. She is also the vice chair of Paxcal. Robin Landis teaches advanced placement U.S. history and pre-AP world history at Woodbridge High School in Virginia. And Jordan Landis is the curator of the Friends Historical Library of Swarthmore College and researches Quakers in the Atlantic world. And she especially enjoys opportunities where she can work with her sister. So welcome to you all, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction, and to everyone who is sticking it out with us here until the bitter end. We're really excited to be here with all of you today. Next slide. So before we begin, today is Indigenous Peoples Day. Jordan and I are Zooming from southeastern Pennsylvania, unceded territory of the Lenape people. Robin is Zooming from northeastern Virginia, traditional lands of the Manahoac. We ask you to join us in acknowledging the Lenape and Manahoac communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations, and to commit ourselves to working towards dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and systems of oppression that have dispossessed Indigenous people of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination, work that is essential to human rights work across the world. I don't really have a smooth transition there, but I'll hand it back to Robin now.
Good afternoon. So I'm a teacher, a high school teacher, probably the only high school teacher here, who teaches advanced placement U.S. history down in Virginia. And last year was a real wake-up call. We made it to March with about 2/3 of the course taught and the review before the exam in May. And suddenly they said we would be out for a week. And then we'll be out through spring break, which would have been 3 weeks. And then we were out for the entire year. So we were really limited in the amount of time we had available for face-to-face instruction. And so we were allowed to schedule 1 Zoom meeting per week. And in the meantime, the College Board announced that the traditional exam was going to be replaced by a modified version. And so you can see on this slide, the traditional exam is 4 parts. The modified exam would be a single part of only 45 minutes, testing periods 1 through 7. The course is divided up into 9 time periods. So 1/3 of the course would not even be taught. And we were just stunned by this. So with that modified document-based question, which is an essay that requires students to make use of provided documents, they also introduced a revised rubric, which actually was pretty opportune. Instead of a 7-point rubric, which included contextualization, thesis, use of the documents, outside evidence, and making connections and demonstrating complex understanding, they added the opportunity to earn points in use of documents. And also they added a second piece of outside evidence, which really gave us the opportunity to look at what we could provide to help these students. So next slide. So our challenge was to review this course, which begins in 1791 and was terminating in 1945 because of the modified exam. We wanted to have students practice their DBQ skills, but we also wanted to provide them with sources, and not just the traditional sources that students see, like the Federal's Papers and other documents that are commonly used even in lower grades in middle and high school. And so we wanted these to be novel. So we paired our use of primary sources with working through Zoom to teach kids something new. And the way we were going to do this was by asking my sister for help. She said, create a wish list, which we did. And so our wish list included folks that were ones that rang a bell with students because it was a historical individual that lived or worked near our school, or that involved pets, or that focused on social injustice or a topic that students were concerned about. And once we had our wish list, we realized that the other teacher and I and my sister and the team at FHL had created a new team called the Dream Team.
Okay, I'm Jordan, and I'm the curator, the sister, and the curator of the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College, or I'm going to call it FHL. I've been working at FHL for about a year when I got the call from Virginia. Just for some background, the mission of FHL is to collect, preserve, and promote study materials that document the history of the Religious Society of Friends, its members, and its characteristic testimonies. So FHL functions not solely as an educational resource for the Swarthmore College community. It's actually a research facility and collection with special relations to the Society of Friends and the wider academic community. So when I got the call from the Virginia teachers, I knew I wanted to help. So the first step was Robin sharing her existing slides. And here is a typical APUSH slide on smuggling. But we could do something a little more. Running with the topic of smuggling as a response to various taxation acts, I tried to think of an example from Quaker history. So this is quite early in the lockdown, and my first thought was to work with a book I had at home where I was locked down. And I came up with the idea of James Claypool's letter book, which was edited and transcribed by Marion Balderston from the manuscript held at HSP. So I pieced the the evidence from that with some notes that I had from the Court Books of London, held at the National Archives in the UK. And I nabbed a picture, an image of the cover of William Penn's letter to the Free Society of Traders, and put it all together on, Robin and I came up with this slide while we chatted on Zoom. And then she invited me to the class period, where I went and talked through the slide, and that was just the beginning. Her next question was about the Great Awakening, and she showed me her slide with usual suspects, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, all of the ones you'd expect from the Great Awakening. So we talked, and as we were chatting, thought about who else we could include. And that gave me an opportunity to use an actual digitized item from FHL. In this case, this is an image of the Public Universal Friend. Celia had just posted this silhouette of the friend on Facebook a few months earlier, so I knew exactly where to find it quickly. And though the friend had been in a few national newspapers and the subject of an NPR podcast the past year, Robin and I guessed the students had likely never heard of the friend. So after a few classes, I figured I couldn't do this alone, and that's where my colleagues got involved. Continuing with the visiting expert model, 2 more staff members from FHL visited class sessions, each taking on a different unit and time period. This was a way to allow multiple staff members the opportunity to share their interests and expertise with the class, but didn't burden any of us. So after a Zoom call and a discussion, we worked together with the teachers to co-create slides incorporating different sources that paired with content in the curriculum. We got to be creative and talk about interesting stories in our collection. We had the chance to use our collections for diverse representation, to present some really powerful images and share some short texts. We could highlight historical figures the students may not have heard of, show them documents, and tell them stories not found in textbooks, which was not only more engaging for the students, but hopefully gave them the great components to good exam answers. So this is a slide with input from FHL archives technician James Truitt, who had digitized and transcribed the letters of Abby Hopper Gibbons. She was a New York Quaker, an abolitionist, and a prison reformer, and part of the In Her Own Right project. So James talked to Robin, and they created this slide, and then James was the visiting expert that week. A bonus was Abby Hopper Gibbons had worked in Fredericksburg, Virginia, so not far from where the students were being taught. Then it was Celia's turn, and one subject on which she focused was 19th century Presbyterian missionary Bell Hawks, whose papers are held at the Presbyterian Historical Society of Philadelphia and are also available on In Her Own Right. So Celia brilliantly picked Hawks because she's a great subject who students definitely didn't know, but also because there was a shot of her cats. So I'm going to hand over to Celia now.
I insisted on putting this slide in because I'm a co-PI on the In Her Own Right project, but of course, Margaret already did a fantastic job. So just to say that we are currently working on digitizing documents of women's activism, 1820 to 1920. So it's really fresh in our minds and conveniently available online. So we've been leaning on this project really heavily, especially during the summer. So as Beth mentioned, I manage the instruction program at the Friends Historical Library, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the experience of working with Robin's class was different from the classes I usually work with. Swarthmore is 100% undergraduate, but we have a variety of experience levels visit us, from first-year seminars to senior honor students, and in a variety of subjects. Theoretically, there shouldn't be too much difference between an AP class in a high school and a first-year college class. The whole point of AP, of course, is that the credits transfer for college credit, but the context is extremely different. But still, one of the reasons I was excited to participate with Robin's class is that when COVID shut down our campus over spring break, all of the classes I had scheduled for the remainder of the semester were canceled by faculty. So I figured that we were going to be in for remote teaching for a while, and I was eager to have this chance to dip my toe into virtual teaching with these high schoolers. In normal times, our faculty usually bring students to the library for an entire class session. So we get them for an hour and a half, sometimes 3 hours, depending on the class. And that time is usually spent in some combination of hands-on activities and discussion. I aim to lecture at them as little as possible. But for the APUSH class, Robin and her co-teacher had so much content to cover, we as archivists only had a few minutes with students during each class. So we had to be really quick. And this turned out to be good practice for the upcoming semester. I would discover Swarthmore's classes are conducted on Zoom for the most part this fall, and because at Swarthmore at least, our instructional time is cut down by a couple weeks this semester. So I have a number of faculty who only want me to join their classes for 10 or 20 minutes. So what can you cover in such a short period of time? Robin was clear about what historical context she wanted each session to cover, but I at least was also thinking about primary source learning objectives for the students. Some of you may be familiar with the guidelines for primary source literacy that were created by the Society of American Archivists and Rare Books and Manuscripts Joint Task Force, released a couple of years ago. It articulates 5 key areas of primary source literacy as listed on this graphic, and 3 to 6 learning objectives within each. I also want to shout out the Mapping the Guidelines resource that you can find on the Teaching with Primary Sources Collective, TPS Collective website. It has a suggested sequencing of the objectives. So our time with the students being so brief and so targeted on historical content areas, we didn't even try to hit all 5 of the key areas for primary source literacy. The learning objectives we focused on were basically all within conceptualizing, understanding, and interpreting. We focused on giving them tools for success with the DBQ, but also understanding that they have a teacher who has been preparing them throughout the school year and knowing that we were not going to cover everything we wanted to. But we did want to spark historical empathy and curiosity, and give them practice in recognizing primary sources, understanding the content, assessing their usefulness for a project, and situating those sources in context. The primary source literacy guidelines don't map exactly to the DBQ rubric, but some are very closely related. You can see we didn't hit on everything, but per the DBQ rubric, we gave them some practice with bringing in context, describing the content of documents, assessing and introducing new sources. I'm also giving us a dotted line for complexity because, as mentioned, part of our goal in selecting sources was sharing ones they wouldn't have seen elsewhere for sources that would surprise and delight students. My favorite example is definitely the public universal friend, as mentioned by Jordan, a gender non-conforming preacher in the 18th century. Definitely a very complicated and interesting figure. For the most part, those are learning objectives I'd want to cover as standard in our college classes as well, at least in history classes. But these are some additional ones that I pretty much always try to cover, even if it's not a history class. We always look at an original document, which nowadays means I'm showing it on a document camera over Zoom or sharing a link to a digitized facsimile. I always emphasize citations, probably since I'm the one who does patron scanning requests a lot of the time, and an incomplete or incorrect citation is just so frustrating. And these last 2 are important to us, especially since we're a Quaker archives. Everything we have is automatically within that bias. It was created or collected by a Quaker, otherwise we wouldn't have it. And that's a pretty critical thing for anyone using our archives to understand, for practical reasons as well as for ethical reasons. And I'll turn it back over to Robin now.
So we had such a great experience with FHL supporting us this past year that we are taking on a new project, which is actually in collaboration also with our advanced placement language teachers. In that course, they will be reading Kendi's book Stamped, which is about racism. And simultaneously, we'll be featuring some sources in the AP History class. And at the end of the year, they'll have a choice of 3 essays to write. And so on this slide is one example of a possible essay question. This source is the Walking Treaty, which we gained information about from FHL. And this was, in this case, the Native Americans in this region lost a tremendous amount of land because the colonists basically swindled them. So we completed this source with our students this past week, and they were extremely engaged by it. They had never heard of it. So as we continue with our study of racism, there are some additional sources that FHL provided us. And Jordan's going to carry on with.
We've got a little more time and experience now, more enthusiasm and maybe a little less panic. FHL collections can support, as Robin said, Woodbridge High School's new curriculum. So we just picked one slide from Robin's slide deck, and this is a slide that shows that we got to introduce students to Benjamin Lay, who published the first anti-slavery tract printed in the US, and whose activism is really fascinating and inspiring. So that was just getting to show off Benjamin Lay there, and I'm going to hand off to Celia to conclude.
So just to summarize kind of the outcomes of this experience, we heard there were evident positive outcomes for students. Anecdotally, they reported, several reported that they enjoyed the time with the FHL visiting experts. Because of the changes to the grading system this year, special for COVID grading, the teachers actually saw the AP tests that the students took. And so we happen to know that several students used the sources that we showed them during class. So we were really excited to hear that. We also heard positive outcomes from the teachers, Robin and her co-teacher, Carolyn. They appreciated the targeted support to help them adapt and find sources in a hectic semester. But they also valued having a sense of community. Robin talks about her dream team and the way that we were able to provide a feeling of, in a time of isolation, a feeling of community. And we, as the archivists, also experienced many positive outcomes. As I said, it was for us an opportunity to get some early practice with online teaching and also to teach high school students, which we don't often do. Usually it's undergrads. And also an opportunity to share our sources, which of course is one of the great joys of our jobs as archivists. And so we have, I think, about 10 minutes left. And so we would love to have a little bit of a discussion while you admire the beautiful face of one of Robin's alpacas. How can archivists and teachers connect when they don't happen to be sisters? What can archivists do to better serve teachers? What opportunities exist right now when many classes are online due to COVID? What opportunities exist now that aren't usually available? And what can we take away from this strange year to carry forward in the future? So those are some of the questions that we're thinking about. And we would love if folks would type in the chat or in the Q&A. And we also have our email addresses shared there. So if you'd like to continue the conversation afterwards, we would be happy to do that as well. And perhaps I'll start with Beth's question in the chat. Do folks think there is more value in creating generic lesson plans for use by any institution, or is there more value in this type of close collaboration with one school, or perhaps one curricular area like APUSH? And I would love to get Robin to weigh in on this, because this is something that we have talked about a lot.
I think that one of the things in my mind when I see this question is that I'm a reader, one of the people who scores the AP exam for the College Board. So I read between 600 and 700 DBQ essays this spring. And there were very few that had anything as engaging and remarkable as what we provided these students. So as Celia said, for the first time, we saw the student responses to the DBQ because of COVID, and seeing these unique sources in the students' responses showed me the effectiveness of this. So again, the sources we provided were things that resonated with the students, that made it more easy for them to remember them. And I think that that's the difference between saying, here's a generic curriculum, even one that would serve the needs of APUSH teachers and students, as opposed to here's one for your class and your students in your region, with very, very memorable and interesting sources that they will hang on to.
I have a follow-up question. You guys obviously have the benefit of the sistership. I'm thinking a lot of the institutions around the Philadelphia area who are near Philadelphia School District and Central Bucks School District, which are two of the biggest school districts in Pennsylvania. As teachers, what advice can you give us to reach out to curriculum developers in school districts to try to begin to build this kind of a collaboration?
This is something we have actually talked about in our meetings, and having the capability to extend this collaboration into the next school year and involve the AP language teachers and students as well. We are extremely aligned with what the College Board is telling us to teach with that curriculum, but at the same time, we're making it very individualized. So one solution we said was, if you know those school districts that you could form a partnership with, simply ask them, survey them, what types of things do they want to see, and ultimately, again, by region or locality, produce a primary source reader that goes with the curriculum that teachers can draw from. And I know both Jordan and Celia had some extended ideas about that recommendation.
Yes, of course, being a big PAC school cheerleader, one of the things I was thinking was, wouldn't it be great if, rather than having to, if teachers, instead of having to know a particular archives and think of a particular archives, if there was an email address they could contact, and that email would get forwarded to PAC school institutions, so they could say, I want a source that's, about medical women in 19th century Philadelphia, and that would go to teach@pacschool.org, and Beth would see it and say, that's a great one for Jessica or for Margaret.
I'm writing that down, don't worry.
I mean, it's a big dream, and I think there's definitely like making those personal connections turns out to be so important and is so difficult to do. But it's also true that, again, leveraging the power of the PAC school community or the Philadelphia community, there are a number of us who do have a personal connection. Like, I have a friend who's a social studies teacher at a charter school in Kensington, and someone else always has the NHD classes come from Masterman. And if we, perhaps there's a way to leverage those networks. So yeah, dreaming really big, but it's been really fun to talk to Robin about it and get her perspective.
And one of the primary things that we learn about in our in-services at school is that it's all about establishing relationships, not only with our students, but with our colleagues. And so this is just taking that to that next level. And I was very fortunate to have my sister as someone who loves history and had access. But think about it, if you're in your repository and you got an email from a teacher begging you for help, there's no way you were going to turn them down.
One question that popped up in chat from Rebecca Johnson: several of us share online exhibitions and topical digital collections, such as In Her Own Right. Do you think teachers are becoming aware of these contextualized collections of primary sources? And I'll add to that, if they aren't, how do we make them aware of it?
We are not aware. We are often very engaged with looking at a published curriculum, whether it's a state standard or national standard or the College Board's curricula for the different courses we teach. But again, if you start local, the schools in your immediate area, there's contacts at your central offices, there's contacts within school buildings, department chairs, who can definitely be effective in disseminating what you're offering. And we'll be happy to have it, because let's face it, teachers teach the same thing year after year. Something new is exciting.
And that for me was another really positive outcome from this experiment in the spring is Robin told us for a number of the sources we shared, she said, my students loved this, this is great, this is gonna be in my lesson plan every year. And that was really, really gratifying to hear.
It's true. Just this week, the Public Universal Friend was taught in Robin's classroom.
Laura Blanchard, who is my predecessor at Paschal, long may she wave, says National History Day, ? And I'll kind of put this out to everybody who's at the conference. What strengths and weaknesses are there in trying to get your collections into the teachers' minds through something like National History Day?
And I wonder if in Laura's question about National History Day, she might be addressing Rebecca's comment about working with student teaching programs. Yeah. And there's the Temple has the CFI program that matches pre-service teachers with local cultural organizations, and they can create a primary source set, create a lesson plan, work with the staff there to create educational resources out of their materials. So that's another great connection and opportunity that I know they're always looking for more cultural organizations to participate.
Are there any other questions for Jordan, Robin, or Celia, or at this point, since we're at the end of our day, for any of the other presenters that you've seen here?
I want to just lift up Tara's comment about a takeaway about how much digitized content exists and how different this experience of COVID would be if it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, when we've just made such huge leaps and strides in the volume we've been able to digitize. Yeah, I totally agree with you.
On a more negative note, I want to just say something came across somewhere in the chat or in someone's comment, but digitization and virtualization isn't free. And we're doing this on top of all of our other work, and resources will be needed. And I think it's something for funders to think about and for all of us to think about.
And to that point, Margaret, something I've been thinking about, I don't know if people have heard this term technical debt, but the idea that you undertake a project and you don't finish it, and then you have this debt to complete the project. We've done so much ad hoc scanning over the past 6 months, where we're just jetting into the office, making some PDF scans, taking pictures with an iPad or a phone, and then it gets sent in an email with no metadata. And did we save time because we didn't take the time to do that metadata, or do we now have this technical debt because we have these resources that we can't find and we've wasted that time? So I don't know.
Well, I have two follow-up questions, and I'm going to use Margaret's example of a poll to elicit your opinion on these. So I'm going to share my screen. So this comes from a question that Marjorie Sly posted earlier in the day. Is scholarship being stunted by a reliance on that which had been digitized or has been digitized? So if you can pop over to the website and let me know what you think of that question. I
think I'm gonna take panelist prerogative and say my response out loud, if that's okay.
Sure.
Which is that I don't think that scholarship is being stunted. I do think it's being bifurcated. I think digital research is a different set of skills and often has different outcomes than traditional archival paper-based research.
I also posted a link to the Passenger Pigeon Manifesto if you guys have not seen that yet, because that's caused quite a bit of controversy over what has been digitized and what can be made available. So far it's 74% say no.
And you're getting some flack that it's not a yes/no question.
Well, that's true, but I literally just created this account while you guys were talking. So.
And Marjorie added a clarification. Her point was that there are materials that aren't being used because they are not yet digitized.
Digitized, yes.
And I think, again, I think it's not a either or. I think that some people who would never have come to the archives are using digital sources, and that's a bonus.
Yeah.
So I think you might be losing some people who have gotten lazy, but I think that overall it is for the good.
And my other question is what efforts, and again, this is very limited, but it's based on a couple of things that have come up in our conversations. What efforts would be most effective in uncovering the silences within our collections? And unfortunately, I didn't allow you to choose more than one, so you'll have to just pick one.
Beth, I didn't realize we were starting Paxical Strategic Planning today.
I have a captive audience, Celia. Why not take advantage of some of their feedback?
Robin and Simon are having a conversation on the chat that I think is really interesting, and I wonder if they want to say them out loud.
I can kind of clarify what I was intending to say. I just mentioned that Library of Congress has a lot of stuff that's digitized, and Robin pointed out that it's an overwhelming amount, and that the readily available ones are typical. So, because I think they have like lesson plans and things, which I haven't looked at closely in a while, but and I also haven't worked with high school teachers, so I'm not sure what's typical at this point. But I guess I was when I found it, I was like, oh, this could be a good option if we don't have something that's really suitable. And I find it overwhelming to search for stuff, and also I get really distracted and because there's so much stuff, so I think just sharing that link with a teacher or a faculty member would not actually be that helpful. But I think if they are collaborating with an archivist in some capacity, then it can be a lot more useful. So hopefully, so yeah.
And Simon, yes, because when we were working on the walking purchase, it's not anything that FHL has much on. So I actually went to the HSP website and the library company to see what they had online. So I was doing sort of a consortial coverage to get what she needed.
Any other questions or comments? If not, I would like to thank everybody who attended today's symposium. I appreciate your time, especially if you had today off. I especially appreciate your coming. I want to thank Mitch Fraz and Betsy Deming at the University of Pennsylvania for their kindness in being our technical host. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Melissa Graff, pardon me, Margaret Graham, Jessica Clark, Dr. Ann Riccouli, Dr. Paula Summerly, Simon Raghavan, Celia Kaust, Ellen Bogan, Robin Landis, and Jordan Landis for being willing to participate in this and sharing their experience and their wisdom with us. Thank you all again.
Thank you too, Beth.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And perhaps I'm just going to throw this out there. It may be worth coming back to this in about 6 months, 9 months to see how everybody's doing and what changes have occurred and how we are dealing with digital surrogacy. But perhaps someone else wants to run that. And on that note, I'm going to bid everyone a fond farewell and have a wonderful week.
Thank you, you too.
Bye-bye.